väldigt festligt och fullsatt.
Ja, det är bra.
Några fler bilder till.
Ja.
Där ska jag ha. Jag hoppas jag anpassar temperaturen till det faktum att det saknas 350 personer. Jävlar vad svagt det här är.
Behöver kyla ner den lite här inne.
Ja. Jag kan ta en del när vi står här. Den tänkte jag ta på ett steg bort bara. 2 steg. Det är 2 steg bort.
Lite smitta är med liberalism. Jag håller lite föreläsningar.
Smittande liberalism. Jaha.
Klockan är 9.
It is now 9 a.m. and the start of the proceedings in the chamber. Prime Minister, Deputy Prime Minister, party leaders and honourable members of Parliament in Sweden. Now, it really is not very common for the Speaker to take the floor just before a debate between party leaders in the Swedish Riksdag, but today I would like to do so. And as you all know, the Riksdag parliamentary session is halfway through its democracy jubilee year. And now ahead of us, we have the major jubilee year 2021, 100 years after the first parliamentary election was held with universal and equal suffrage. This must be celebrated, even if the way we do it has to be adapted to the current situation. However, today I'd like to speak about another anniversary which also, to a very large extent, has to do with the Riksdag. On the 11th of January 1971, that is 50 years and 2 days ago, the new unicameral Riksdag held its very first meeting. This took place in the temporary premises of the Riksdag near Sergels Torg in Stockholm. This anniversary will also be celebrated in different ways throughout the year. Now, the introduction of the unicameral Riksdag was a process taking the shape of many steps on a long journey. Historic changes in society are also reflected in the political system. Now, when the bicameral Riksdag was introduced with the representational reforms of 1866, there was a shift from the old social order to the emerging demands for democracy. Parliamentarism was established in 1917, and already at that time the bicameral system was a hotly debated issue. And So it was also in the first Constitutional Commission of Inquiry of the 1950s and the second Constitutional Commission of Inquiry of the 1960s. The aim was to make parliamentarism more distinct, with only one chamber that the government was responsible for, and to ensure that the election results would have a direct and unequivocal impact without the step-by-step renewal of the first chamber. The decision concerning a unicameral Riksdag was voted through in 1969. Gone were concepts like the first chamber, the second chamber, reconciliation, joint vote, and put simply, you might say that the indirectly elected first chamber disappeared, while the directly elected second chamber was expanded to include 350 members, and at the same time a thorough overhaul of the system of parliamentary committees was also made, and the committees that we know today were introduced. I wouldn't mind sitting here telling you more about this, but we have a very important debate ahead of us, and luckily there is a publication about this anniversary available on the website. It's available to everybody, and it has also been emailed to you, members of parliament. As the ninth speaker of the unicameral Riksdag, I hope that you will find it a good read. Later this year, the Riksbank Jubilee Fund will publish a book about this anniversary, so if you wish to learn more about this, you'll be able to do so. Now, thus, all in all, there are about 150 reasons to celebrate one's democratic commitments just a little bit more than usual this year. The 100 years that have passed since democracy was established in Sweden underlines the importance of the untiring work that is being carried out for democracy itself. The 50 years that have passed since the unicameral Riksdag was introduced reminds us that gaining democracy is not enough. We must also constantly develop it. The importance of winning and safeguarding and vitalizing democracy is self-evident, bearing in mind that the fact that we may never take it for granted, the importance of which we all saw in the unacceptable events that unfolded recently in the American Congress. Honourable members, the struggle for universal suffrage of yesteryear led to the birth of democracy in Sweden. The reforms of yesterday gave us our unicameral Riksdag, here where we are meeting today. Today's democracy gives us opportunities and forces us to shape both our present and our future. So now we have the first debate between the party leaders, the first debate of 2021. Thank you.
Och med det.
So with that, here we are, the party leaders debate and the rules. The rules mean that the Prime Minister and the leader of the largest opposition party are entitled to a speech of no more than 7 minutes, and the other party leaders are entitled to a speech of no more than 5 minutes. And given the relative size of the parties, and after the first speeches, there's no right to reply. This is followed by a second round of at max 2 minutes. There is a free right to reply to these speeches, and the rejoinders are taken in order of the relative size of the parties. The time allowed for each rejoinder is limited to 1 minute in accordance with the dueling method. In other words, a total of 4 minutes per duel. The speeches are made from the rostrum on the platform, and the rejoinders made from the rostrums in front of the platform. First, Prime Minister Stefan Löfven from the Social Democrats. Thank you. The floor is yours.
Mr. Speaker, Sweden is leaving a dark year behind it. The vaccine, however, meant that the first few days of 2021 had a more hopeful note, but we will need to strengthen our country, building it stronger. I will get back to that. I'd like to start with what happened just a few days into the new year when horrifying images were broadcast across the world. The images of how the US Capitol in Washington was stormed by people who refused to accept the linchpin of a democracy, a legitimate election outcome. Trump supporters injected and intervened with the work of Congress. They forced the elected representatives to seek protection and shelter. They attacked the American democracy, cheered on by President Trump, who continued to spread the lie of a stolen election. A dark moment for the US, a dark moment for the country, which for many people symbolizes freedom. Congress managed to reconvene and confirm the election result, which in itself is testament to the strength of the institutions. But the attack last week also showed that one of the strongest democracies in the world can be damaged by polarization, populism, and extremism. Europe and Sweden need to draw lessons from this, because here as well there are those who would like to shut our open societies. Sweden, of course, is not the US. However, no democracy is solid for eternity. So we are not immune to polarization or an undermining of credibility, nor is the Swedish people, in spite of the strong trust in everything from the tax authorities to our courts. They are not immune. We have great strengths deeply rooted in popular movements, in neighbourly cooperation, local newspapers and public service broadcasting, but that is not sufficient. We are not immune to dissension and division. Dissension between groups can gain force. A false piece of news can be spread as truth. Science and opinions can be mixed up here. And an actual election outcome can be undermined here as well, in this beloved country of ours. We know this. We know that there are forces who would like to undermine democracy here, and there clearly are movements who would like to split and ruin the trust people have in each other and in Sweden. And we know the importance of being on the right side of history when it truly matters. We need to live according to that belief. We need to see the seriousness of this present day and see the role we have in the future of our country. The parties we represent have many differences in opinions, but we share one common responsibility, ensuring that people will trust the institutions of our country, trust the courts, election results, and public authorities. As publicly elected representatives, we share the responsibility in sticking to the fact that a truth is the truth. We don't just throw lies at others, at opponents, to be applauded by our own. We need to have a society strong enough to ensure that any attack on Swedish democracy will fail, and our cohesion will be strong enough to ensure that all attempts at spreading dissent will fall. Safeguarding Swedish democracy is a task which is always greater than our differences of opinion or party symbols. This is what we owe the Swedish people to safeguard. Mr. Speaker, every person in this country must be able to trust Sweden. Trust that when you need it, our country is there for you. When you grow old, when you call the police, when you fall ill. However, the brutal year of 2020 has shown us that Swedish welfare needs to be severely improved and be improved upon and upgraded. Society has detracted over too long under several different governments. Society has detracted. Post boxes, local care, primary care centres, schools, and it can be noticed both in rural areas and in high-rises in urban areas. We see it in elderly care and healthcare. Swedish welfare remains strong, but it has been weakened, and therefore, Mr. Speaker, I propose today that all parties agree to give us sufficient breathing space to focus on welfare. The welfare of this country will be what we are truly proud of in this country. We're already working to ensure that those who have care services in the home will have a dedicated point of contact and strengthen the rights of the elderly by looking into a new Elderly Care Act. We're improving the conditions and employment terms for those who work in elderly care, offering full-time jobs and paid vocational training, protecting the registered title of auxiliary nurse to attract more people to that profession. But we Social Democrats, we see that more is needed at all levels, particularly during this crisis. And my proposals to have breathing space is the following. Refrain from municipal tax reductions currently so that necessary investments won't take place. Focus fully and entirely on welfare in all budgets at all political levels. And 3, money allocated for elderly care must be used by the municipalities for elderly care and nothing else. And 4, no more privatization within elderly care during the crisis. To succeed, all party leaders need to shoulder the responsibility of keeping up a very close dialogue with their party representatives at regional and municipal levels, and I look forward to hearing what other parties think of these proposals. Mr. Speaker, our country still needs to come together. We need to work together to do our utmost to protect lives and health. Our country needs cooperation to re-establish and reinvent Swedish elderly care. We as elected representatives, we owe the Swedish people to safeguard the democracy of this country. We need to do our very best for Sweden in times of crisis and in the future. Thank you for your attention.
Tack. Ordet för anförande.
Thank you. Ulf Kristersson of the Conservative Party has the floor for his first address.
Herr talman.
Mr. Speaker, this is the beginning of a new year, a new opportunity for a new beginning in a very difficult situation. If we deal with our problems, then we can also make use of our opportunities, and the Swedish potential is enormous. The small country with the big companies, with the innovation capacity and industriousness, but things will not improve automatically. If we are to be successful in this decade, we need three things. We need to understand that there are problems, we need a new, clear course, and we need an ability and a willingness to act. Almost all Swedes understand that the situation is serious. In Sweden, 1 out of 1,000 died in corona. 9,667 people, to be brutally exact. Many of us have lost a family member. Now, the Swedish strategy has to change because the spread of infection will not be stopped by saying that things are serious at press conferences, and things do not improve when those who preach in front of others do not live as they learn. It is understandable that no one in government knew that the Director General of the Civil Contingencies Agency left the country in the midst of the crisis. In other countries, that would have led to consequences for others in addition to the director. Now we have the vaccine being the light shining in the dark, but if we are to manage this largest mass vaccination in Swedish history, we need a unifying national leadership. No effort can be spared, no time can be wasted. The test failure of the spring cannot be repeated. In Germany, in England, in Denmark, they're building vaccination clinics in field hospitals, in ice hockey rinks and football arenas. We could do a lot more in Sweden as well, and in a best-case scenario, this would prove to be unnecessary. Employers could play a role, corporate healthcare could help with vaccinations, and the dentists could help as well. The armed forces could also play an important role. It's actually very difficult to understand that the commander-in-chief himself has to ask if he can help out. Only the government can give the armed forces that task to help, and they should do so. Sweden is just one of 4 EU countries that are not using apps for contact tracing. How is that possible in one of the most digitalized countries in the world? Has the government even asked one of our successful tech companies to help? Different types of certificates that you've been vaccinated could be used as well. We need to think outside the box. For every week that passes, the human and the financial price is higher and higher, and the government has to step up or step out of the way. But COVID is not the only problem in Sweden. We see more and more unemployment and marginalization, and not even every second woman who immigrated from Africa, from the Middle East, has a job. We have shootings, we have killings, we have people being killed, we have serious crime, and that is the second pandemic that we're experiencing in Sweden. In that respect, 2020 was the deadliest year in Swedish history. 47 individuals were killed in shootings. The youngest was 12. 8 children died in stabbings or shootings. And 2021 started in the worst imaginable way. The father of young children, Johan Forsberg, was stabbed to death January 2nd, 8 o'clock at night at the automatic teller. And the man who admitted to the murder should have been locked up. He had been sentenced for killing a 17-year-old guy, but he had escaped during a walk. I'm sure that Stefan Löfven is just as appalled as everyone else, but that is not enough, because with power comes great responsibility. You need to do what is necessary. You need to understand what is happening and you need to do something. And if we are to stop this development, if we are to turn things around, we cannot just talk about things being unacceptable at press meetings. My proposal is that we do like Denmark, double penalties, wiretappings, body searches, things that we, the moderate party, have proposed, but where the Social Democrats say no. So what government you have in a country, that does make a difference. Mr. Speaker, January 6th, we saw almost unimaginable images from Capitol Hill in Washington, D.C. The dysfunctional presidency of Donald Trump came to a very unworthy end. The USA will have an opportunity for a new start in a week, with Joe Biden being sworn in as president, and that gives us hope for a new American leadership that will re-establish the American role in climate policy, the collaboration with the EU, a country that defends the rule of law and the integrity of democracy. But I'm also hoping for a leadership that will break this unforgiving political polarization, where people who think differently do not even talk to each other anymore. But I'm afraid that destructive discourse will gain root here as well. And if you're not blind to defects at home, or if you're a collaborator, well, if you're not, then you see that development in Sweden as well. Those of us who are leaders in Swedish politics, regardless of what party we belong to, we need to take this seriously. Political differences are important, but there are more things uniting us than separating us. Nyamko Sabuni recently said, "You do not win that fight for a better Sweden by isolating opponents, but by truly solving societal problems." And I think this is important and simple. The moderate party will continue to be the unifying party in Swedish politics, will respect and will talk to all political parties, and will try to get support for reforms that we believe in. Mr. Speaker, the government likes to put blame on others and tries to find faults in others, but I know that there are so many in Sweden who want to deal with problems, and that is what I want to focus on. Thank you. Thank you. And we continue with Jimmy Åkesson from the Sweden Democrats, please.
Mr. Speaker, now, a new year, here we are. Good reason, I think, to underline how important it is to safeguard our democratic institutions and not least the values carried by these, that we respect the outcome of a democratic election. And it is also about respecting people's different opinions. And what has happened in the United States after the election is, if you have this conviction, then it is really irresponsible and totally unacceptable. Just as important, Mr. Speaker, as this basic respect for differing opinions is the right for every person to communicate these opinions. Therefore, I believe that it is a huge problem. We have multinational oligarchs that control global infrastructure for information and communication and use that power that they have to, based on their own interests, determine who may say what. That is also totally unacceptable. And this is something that every democratic person in our country and in the rest of the world should be very, very concerned about what is happening right now. Mr. Speaker, the world's best school, the world's best health care, the world's best care for the elderly. That's what was said, wasn't it? In the country with the highest taxation. But that's not what happened. Not least the care for the elderly has really lagged behind. And the Corona Commission of Inquiry, their first sub-report, really came with criticism, strong criticism against the government. And many are asking the question how Sweden, who is such a good country at collecting tax from its citizens, can at the same time have a situation where we have a situation for the elderly and the marginalized and those who are ill is so difficult. And the answer is politics, actually. Very strange priorities is the answer as well. And also, not least, a lack of understanding the realities. And because decades, Sweden has just looked on as the most vulnerable in our society have ended up in this situation. And they have and still have problems taking responsibility for that. The same thing goes for crime. Nobody wants to take responsibility for how we've ended up in this situation. The government isn't prepared to do what we need to do to deal with these gangs and organized crime. And the pandemic, of course, has its impact on our lives, but it does not stop crime. The number of shootings is increasing. More people are being killed. The violence continues. Also last year, the number of shootings increased by 10% compared to 2019. The number of people killed increased by 12%. And unfortunately, there is no vaccine for these type of criminals. However, there are means to deal with it, but we need resources for that. We need also political will. And unfortunately, both these components are lacking far too often in the Swedish government. However, in another world, on the Western liberal, left liberal planet, there's always a huge coffer for everything. We can give money, insurance, and all sorts of things and benefits to jihad terrorists, and when they haven't got any more money left, they can get more money wherever they are, even in a war zone, which is absurd. And it's even more absurd in the light of the fact that in the last year we've been forced to see new Islamist terrorist attacks in our proximity. And it's even more absurd, naturally, Mrs. Speaker, when the government is also open to pursue a very irresponsible immigration policy. Doesn't the government see what's happening in this country? We need a new leadership, and we've never needed one more than we do today. Thank you. Thank you. Next, Annie Lööf from the Centre Party. The floor is yours.
Herr talman.
Mr. Speaker, things are always darkest just before dawn. This is a saying which is a good way of summing up the times we're living in right now. In the midst of a serious pandemic, more people die every day, elderly people infected in hospitals and care homes, overfull ICU units, elective surgery cancelled for both adults and children, healthcare workers who are working under unspeakable pressure with no time for recovery, continued extensive community spread, and businesses fighting with everything they have to survive the day, to keep on their employees, to not have their lives' work ruined. Hundreds of thousands of people who've seen reduced financial margins during the crisis. However, at the same time, we do see a dawn somewhere over there in the future. There's a vaccine which can hopefully change a lot of our lives, and it's being spread across the world, and we're learning more about this disease with every single day. Now it's time for all of us to shoulder our part of the responsibility, including ministers, MPs and Director Generals. They need to take the lead and act in a way which will reduce community spread, complying with the advice that government agencies and we ourselves have underlined the value of for a long time. But it is also time to be more forceful than our leadership in a way which will safeguard healthcare and the future of our businesses, one step ahead rather than one step behind. The Centre Party has been driving the government before us for a long time. Our voice has made a difference. We were early in pointing out the need to refocus the Swedish strategy on in a number of areas, but we need to do even more to stop community spread, give the healthcare sector the resources and tools they need, and do away with every potential obstacle to a successful vaccination of the population as a whole. Ever since the spring, we've been pushing for a new pandemic law, and now that we finally have one in place, it's up to the government to use this in a proactive and efficient manner. At the same time, it remains extremely important that whenever the government shuts down operations and activities, we need to compensate the businesses concerned. We will keep pushing the government. We've also been a decisive force in safeguarding our Swedish companies during the crisis. We've had respite on tax payments, adjustment support, more government sick pay, but it's not sufficient. The support and the aids which are decided upon need to get out to the businesses too quickly. It is insanely upsetting that the money is taking so long to be paid out. There's no room for further wait, and the government has to be very clear in demanding of the EU to change all those rules which are claimed to reduce the pace of payment. There are no other options. Without our businesses, Sweden will grind to a halt. So the government should have listened more carefully, taking action more quickly and more efficiently back in the autumn. But it's not too late to do the right thing, do more, make a difference. Let the new year also be a new start for a more forceful leadership. Don't put the responsibility on someone else, somewhere else. Don't wait for someone else to act, because we need to continue moving forward also in other areas, ensuring that we continue to work on bringing Sweden forward through the crisis and involving everyone, all the women and children who are living closed up with a violent partner. Help them find a way out of violence, oppression, and into safety and security. The Centre Party has proposed stable funding for the refuges for women in the country and for the National Centre for Knowledge of Men's Violence Against Women, showing them that we can plan, give them a chance to have long-term planning, helping more. We've shown them how we can change legislation to put a stop to custody battles and strengthening penalties for serious crimes in close relationships. And I hope that both the government and the other parties in the Riksdagen can adhere to these proposals. We want to raise and improve safety for more and give more people a chance of a brighter future. We also need to do more to put a stop to climate change. There was no break in climate change during the pandemic, and thanks to the Centre Party, Sweden are now investing in a stronger Swedish bioeconomy to make better use of the renewable resources we have in our forests and in our agriculture. As of the new year, there's now a green deduction, making it easier for you and me to be climate smart. We're introducing a reduction obligation, making it more beneficial to have renewable fuels in your tank. We're focusing on green technology, and we want to be an example locally, because climate changes will not take any country borders into consideration. We need to resolve all this together. So we will be an active, constructive force to reduce community spread and safeguard the future for our jobs and our companies, our businesses. Thank you. Thank you. Nooshi Dadgostar is the next speaker for the Left Party. You have the floor, please.
Herr talman.
Mr. Speaker, the COVID pandemic has impacted Sweden severely. More than 9,000 individuals have died, and many more are suffering from the consequences of this disease that we do not yet know enough about. Behind these figures, we have a beloved grandparent, a father, or a close friend. People with the dreams and expectations, and many elderly who thought that they would be safe in our Swedish care system. And the healthcare personnel has done enormous efforts to prevent the spread of this disease. We have crisis agreements that have been activated, and healthcare personnel work 60-hour weeks without being able to take vacation. And we have a healthcare system that do not have enough personnel, and they have carried the frustration of people this year. Before Christmas, we saw the conclusions of the Coronavirus Commission, and the criticism geared government is devastating. They're describing a care scandal. 3 out of 4 individuals who died in our healthcare system. And the Commission says that the elderly care was not equipped for a pandemic, and the employees were left alone trying to manage the crisis situation. And where was the government, and where were the parties of the January agreement? Why is it so easy to find money in the grants for companies with lots of resources, but we cannot place the elderly first? The government has said with words that the elderly were to be protected, but that they haven't done enough, far from enough. I'm not here trying to point fingers saying that the left has answers to all these questions, and the strategy will be evaluated later and will also have more answers. But what we have known for a long time, and what is also established by the Coronavirus Commission, is that there are big problems in our elderly care system. And here politicians could have done something and still can do something. And the government has not taken its responsibility. The Commission says that we have a great number of people working on hourly contracts in elderly care, and that has increased the contagion. The more people on hourly contracts, the greater the spread. And we have the greatest proportion of people on hourly contracts in the Nordics. We have also seen that it's been difficult with coordination. In Stockholm alone, we have some 80 different companies providing home care services, and the crisis notifications didn't reach everyone, not quickly enough. And we also see that this is a sector that is underfinanced and understaffed, and that has made it difficult, for example, to isolate those who got the disease, and that has cost lives. The disaster, the catastrophe that is described by the Commission is a result of a neoliberal policy, and we need a completely different route after what has happened. And this is the reality. The government should have known, and that they did not take into consideration the problems that we have in the elderly care system when planning the Swedish COVID strategy. That is a mistake. That is not acceptable, and we need someone to be held responsible. The left party has for decades talked about the needs we have in elderly care, the great needs we have. We have presented solutions to these problems again and again. And when we saw the beginning of the pandemic, when we had party leader meetings, we talked about this, that we needed preparedness. And we asked questions, but we didn't really get any response from the other parties. And now more people need to act. We need to put more resources into the elderly care. What is significant for a democracy is also that people can be held responsible. We cannot have politicians at different levels just casting blames at others. So someone has to be held responsible. And I also assume that people will assume that responsibility. Many of us have left beloved relatives and friends, and Stefan Löfven now has to sort out who is responsible for this catastrophe that we've seen in our elderly care sector. We have to ensure that this never happens again. Thank you. Thank you. And we continue with Emma Busch from the Christian Democrats. Please, the floor is yours.
Herr talman.
Mr. Speaker, the first week of this year was the darkest week during this pandemic in Sweden, because now we see the largest number of deaths since the beginning of the pandemic. More people are dying in Sweden today per week than have died in Norway during the whole pandemic. At the same time, we see how healthcare is under terrible stress. The number of ICU patients has increased threefold at Sahlgrenska University Hospital in Gothenburg in only 3 weeks. Operations have been cancelled, even for children with cancer. Far too many people have sacrificed far too much. Grandparents will never see their grandchildren, children who were never given the chance to say goodbye. Hurt and sorrow in our society. This week will have passed the 10,000 mark. Why has Sweden been hit so hard? The answer has been given by the Corona Commission of Inquiry. It is not possible to protect risk groups and at the same time have a huge spread of the virus in society. Premeditation. Many people strongly objected when I used that word, and I claimed that in the spring the government had with open eyes allowed huge spread of transmission in society. Now I think that many people have perhaps choked on that criticism. During the pandemic, we have lacked a national leadership. It is human to make errors. Leadership is not always about making a perfect decision. Leadership is about having the courage to change course when you see that the course that you have chosen is no longer the right one. So when the government saw how wrong it all turned out, when Sweden stood out so strongly already in the spring, why did we say the course instead of adjusting and changing? It boils down to not wanting to lead. Instead, they wanted to duck and delegate. And I know that because I, in fact, asked them, which different scenarios have you planned for? How many ICU places? How about the care for the elderly? How many more can be tested? How many more can be traced? How are you preparing for the second wave? And all we got to hear was mumbling. Now, just take a look at Boris Johnson's actions in the UK. Now, people are just sort of muttering about that. But anyway, he did change course when he realised that his corona strategy didn't hold, when it cost lives. Then just take a look at the Social Democratic leaders and their actions and statements over the Christmas period. And it's not... one just has to wonder, what's in the water on Sveavägen 68, the HQ of the Social Democrat? That means that the Social Democratic leaders would rather accept mistakes rather than admit them. They prefer to duck than change, even when it costs lives. We now have a pandemic act, and that initiative for this act should have been taken by the government a long time ago. Instead, we have had to put pressure on the government for that act by the Social Affairs Committee. We can drag them to the well, but we can't force them to drink. It's only the government that can use the Pandemic Act, and we really do expect them to do so. The government has the responsibility to leave the country. They knew just as well as we did that the care for the elderly suffered from structural problems already before the pandemic, and we also know that the regions have their structural problems, so the government must ensure that the vaccination process works, that if there are problems, the government will lend its support and not wring their hands and not blame others. They need to act. And if you lack the courage to act, then resign. This government's resistance to change, this lack of leadership skills, is not just visible in the corona policy. We see it in crime policy. People are losing their sense of security. Shootings and explosions can be carried out without punishment. But the government is not introducing the Adriana laws because it's not in the January agreement. Already before the corona pandemic, our waiting queues for healthcare was the longest we've ever seen in Sweden. So the government has no agenda to change the structure of healthcare because it's not in the January agreement. And so the government is about to lose when it comes to labour law, migration, because they couldn't agree on what was in this agreement. Now, the vaccine has arrived. But when the pandemic is over, then we will be here, still be here with these social problems. The January agreement will be there, but we will really need new leadership. We went to the election to say that you should have faith in Sweden, and we've seen that you can't. Sweden deserves a better, new leadership. Thank you.
Ordet för anförande.
Next, we have Johan Persson from the Liberal Party. Floor is yours.
Tack, herr talman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The American meltdown is a tragedy. The institutions were able to withhold the blow, however, on the final day, at the final attack. Unfortunately, the tragedy in the US tells us a lot about the crisis of democracy and its challenges. The platforms of the tech giants have clearly shown and created the foundation for the best time of conspiracy theories. We can openly question facts, spread lies, and see populism grow and spiral out of control. How could the populist and anti-democrat in the US actually gather 74 million votes? Reasonably decent people also voted for him. How far can a polarization be taken without the death of democracy? We need to learn from this. Several other countries, also within the EU, are moving in the same gloomy direction. Sweden also has its own share of these populists and extremists, for that matter. The legitimacy of the Riksdag can be found in its ability to creating safety and good opportunities for all its citizens. It's about evening out the DNA luck of the draw, which together with our the conditions we live in when we grow up lays the foundation for our lives. At the end of the day, we are the only ones who can work hard and make our own decisions to shape our lives. The role of politics is to give us the best possible chances regardless of our starting point. This is the core and the credo of liberalism. Mr. Speaker, most deal with this crisis responsibly. The government is contributing with support for businesses, even if more urgently needs to be done to support businesses, culture and civil society. People who work in healthcare, care services and schools are making extraordinary contributions in this difficult time. There have been shortcomings in the Swedish strategy. Responsibility and accountability will be required. Changes are necessary. We need to be given the time to mourn those we've lost in the pandemic and work with other losses that were afflicted by. Even if we're still at the midst of fighting this pandemic and at the beginning of vaccination, we need to look very closely with a holistic approach on our serious problems in society. We want a real, broad, new start for Sweden, and the Liberals have listened to the people who carry this society on their shoulders, hardworking, caring, people who want the schools to focus on knowledge and good order, focusing on the children who are in difficulty more than over all others, giving everyone with a talent a chance to grow, people who want the social services to step in for children whose parents are unable to care for them. These people who carry society on their shoulders, they want there to be healthcare and care services for everyone who needs it, of high quality. They want people with disabilities to be given more power to live their own lives with a well-functioning public support system. They want to see an improved legal security. Grandma, mother, or your mother or your own children should not be in jeopardy of serious crime. They want people who choose crime as their way of life to be punished in a relevant and as a consequence of their criminal actions, who feel that shootings, robberies and gang criminality are some of the worst problems in society. And these people also want Sweden to be a country of solidarity, but not a naive country, where there's an opportunity for immigrants to truly integrate, where you need to speak the language. It goes without saying. Citizenship is the final aim of a demanding process of integration. These people also want us to be responsible for the climate threat, working together with other countries, not least in the EU, to refocus. We need to do everything to save this planet from an ecological disaster. These people who carry society on their shoulders, they know that it's not politicians, but the forces that create welfare, not least Swedish businesses, which lay the foundation for our welfare. Mr. Speaker, The Liberals have been waging political battles for over 100 years to safeguard our democratic open society always. Liberty needs to be constantly defended. The people who carry society on their shoulders can put their trust in the Liberals. Today's Swedish government was not on the top of our wish list, but after a government crisis that lasted 134 days, we shouldered our responsibility and contributed to ensuring that Sweden had a government with a liberal reform agenda. With my address, I want to underline that in the longer term, Sweden needs something different, not just a government who's forced to implement one or other liberal reform, but rather one which is driven by a strong liberal vision. It is time for change once we are through this pandemic. It is time for a Sweden of possibilities. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you. Isabella Lövin of the Green Party is next on the speakers list. You have the floor, please.
Herr talman.
Mr. Speaker, a month ago, the entire world watched when votes were being counted in the US election, hour by hour. Every vote counts was the message, and there was a great victory for Biden. There is no doubt about that. But what has happened after that shows us with frightening clarity that a democracy is not just about counting votes during an election, because not just votes, but also voices count all the time. Those who yell the loudest, those who keep quiet, those who feel that they're not important, think that everyone else should act, those who are scared, those who keep quiet, let lie past, even if they know better, those who do not care, the collaborators, all these voices, all these votes count. One of the strongest moments in my life was about a year ago when I visited the Srebrenica Museum in Sarajevo. The war in Bosnia, well, it feels to me like it happened just yesterday. I do remember my kids being small, and the shellings of Sarajevo were shown on my television in my living room. I went to Sarajevo and I met people my age, and they had been there in the war, where people were neighbors, killed neighbors. Religion and ethnicity had been totally uninteresting, but all of a sudden that defined who was a friend and who was a foe, who could be murdered. On that wall in the museum, there was a quote that had been printed out, was there together with the pictures showing mass graves and homes that had been destroyed with the toys and clothes. And it said, "The only thing necessary for the triumph of evil is that good men do nothing." Mr. Speaker, democracy is not something that you just do away with once every 4 years on election day. Democracy and peaceful development means that people, citizens, have to take responsibility every day. And of course, we, the political leaders, we have a greater responsibility to not polarize, to not point at skin color, not build walls, not talk about simple solutions to complicated problems. We need to be courageous. We need to show that we're willing to talk, build bridges, and stand up for the truth, even if it's complicated. We live in a time of upheaval. We're in the midst of a global pandemic that has turned much of the world order upside down. We're in the middle of a climate crisis, and the consequences of that climate crisis become more and more visible every day. And in addition to that, we have a crisis when it comes to the trust in democracy. And those of us who are here in the chamber are the ones who have to show that democracy is the only way through which we can build a sustainable, resilient society. I'm very, very grateful to all of those who have stood in the front line in this pandemic, saving lives, making sure that the society can continue to work. But that gratitude is not enough if we cannot prevent the next global catastrophe. We have to put an end to unsustainable animal husbandry, devastation of forests and oceans, the spread of microplastics, chemicals, and hormone-disrupting substances, antibiotics, that make bacteria resistant. All of this will lead to a disaster if we do not do something. The collapsing ecosystems, new threats, new viruses, new diseases, new threats against people's life and health. We have to take responsibility together. We have to take a responsibility for the future. We have to look beyond the topic of the day, and we have to show that we're willing to take responsibility for a good society, for fellow human beings, for animals, for future generations. And we need to take that responsibility seriously. Will be my last party leader debate in the parliament, and I have to conclude by saying that I'm so grateful for this trust that has been shown in me by voters, the hard work that is being done by my party colleagues every day. But I also want to say thank you to other political parties, everyone working for democracy. Thank you to everyone listening, watching this on TV as well, because your interest in politics is absolutely necessary to keep democracy alive. Your vote does count. Thank you. That concludes the first round of this debate, and we're going to start the second round, where we'll also have rejoinders, and we will begin with the Prime Minister, Stefan Löfven.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Every reform which my government has implemented since 2014 has had the aim of strengthening Sweden, its citizens, and giving them security. Every job and every new police officer employed, every road built is about building a stronger Sweden. We could make the most of this crisis with 350,000 more people in a job compared to 2014, 100,000 of those working in the Swedish welfare sector. And we could do this with 100,000 new places of training in the special focus and investment on education. Real investments, but we need to do a great deal more to truly build a stronger country, stronger elderly care sector and welfare sector that can be a support for everyone, building our democracy to be able to deal with attempts to split and to create dissent. We will continue along that path. I think most people are prepared to do everything they can to strengthen welfare at municipal level, at regional level, and at national level, and I therefore hope that we can agree to give the elderly care and the health care some peace of mind, some breathing space to work, so that the money that has been allocated for the elderly care will be used for elderly care purposes, and that we refrain from further privatization in the midst of a crisis. Doing this is one step in the right direction to strengthen Swedish welfare, strengthening trust and strengthening this country of ours. Thank you. Thank you. Ulf Kristersson of the Moderate Party, Jimmy Åkesson, Sweden Democrats, Annie Lööf Center Party, Nasrid Augustar, Ulf Babushki, the Christian Democrats, and National Liberals have asked for rejoinders. First, Ulf Kristersson of the Moderate Party.
Mr. Speaker, there are two things that are very topical in Sweden today: COVID and serious crime, and they're very different, but a great concern, both of them. We have had a trial where two boys were tortured at a cemetery in Stockholm, and the sentence was 9, respectively 5 years in prison. And we heard before that they would be given severe punishes. Well, this is the way it is. The court has only followed the law, and the law says that there should be a youth rebate. 2018, we had a proposal that should have entered into force, and that was just before this incident with the torture. And had that been the case, that act been enforced, then both of these accomplices would have been sentenced to 9 years. And I would like to ask why that was not introduced.
Thank you. But I think that you've also forgotten there's another issue that many are talking about, that is democracy, safeguarding democracy, and not being attracted by those forces that would like to do away with democracy. That's a different discussion. But the answer to your question is that the government bill, and it was criticised actually when it did its rounds, as it were, for point of reference, and there were many instances that criticised it. The the Prison and Probation Service, for example, and when there was such a lot of criticism from these instances, then the government then decided to redo and amend the government bill so that it can be passed. That's the reason why it's delayed. And Ulf Kristersson, I think that you and I, we both want to deal with crime properly, which is why a proposal will be put forward, but it will be a changed proposal.
Måste veta vad den vill. Även om remissinstanser.
But you have to know what you want, even if you have others saying that you're not correct. And this youth rebate, when it comes to sentencing of young people, well, there will always be people who think that that is not correct. There will always be people who think more about those who commit the crimes than those who are impacted by the crime. And you could have presented a finished proposal, and it would then have entered into force because this torture took place, and then those individuals that committed this crime would have been sentenced to long punishments, and that would have given some sense of justice for those who were impacted by this. But it's like the government doesn't have a voice or an opinion on its own. Final rejoinder. Prime Minister, yes. Well, when the moderate party was in power, I think that you would have been bothered if the legal system heavily criticised a government bill. But anyway, let's put this very clearly, that Ulf Kristersson, the leader of the moderate party, is standing here saying that they only have a view, whoever, the courts, the prosecutor services, the legal system. That doesn't matter really, does it? But the government does know what it wants, which is why we're going to put forward a government bill with regard to these reduced prison sentences for young people. But we're not going to do it when the legal system opposes the way we did it. But now we know what the moderate party feels about this and your view of the legal system. And I think that's a very poor judgment. That's the end of that round of rejoinder. Next, Jimmy Åkesson from the Swedish Democrats.
Herr talman, apropå det senaste.
Mr. Speaker. This so-called Upper Secondary School Act. Well, there it wasn't all that important with what other people and agencies that commented on this, what this felt. But that was not what I was going to talk about. What I wanted to do was that I wanted to ask a couple of questions that have to do with the democracy and freedom of expression. I did read what Minister Ygeman said, and he has said that even if you can express your opinion, that doesn't mean that others have to spread it, and that's reasonable. But today we have digital IT giants, and they take it upon themselves to limit this freedom of expression. They shut down people who have different opinions. Could be in Sweden, also the President of the United States and other conservative representatives across the globe. What do you think about that? Is that reasonable?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I share your view that or the view of the minister rather, that just because you believe something and say something that somebody else may spread it, you have to take responsibility for what you say as an individual. And I think that we have discussed the issues that we have in social media, because what was, for me at least, supposed to be a perfect possibility for people to spread knowledge, have contact, reinforce democracy became something else, and then you have to deal with that. So the question is the conclusion that you draw from this. Now, to my mind, we need regulations actually with regard to social media. We need to be able to regard them as a paper newspaper. And there's somebody who's responsible for the content. That's how we need to deal with it. And I don't see that these huge owners of the platforms that make the decision, we need regulation to stop this. because this has led to the craziness that took place in the United States.
Ytterligare ett exempel.
Mr. Speaker, this is yet another example of, how you look at the things, look at reality. And I do not buy what Stefan Löfven says. Social media today are dominating the political discourse and the debate in society. We've seen them also dominate election campaigns. And if you own such a platform, you also own that information infrastructure. This is not just a paper, but a company with enormous power. And today we have a situation where specific companies can decide what can be said and who can say something. In an election campaign, for example, I have party friends who have been shut out of these platforms without knowing why. And I am pleased to hear the Prime Minister say that this has to be regulated, but I'm afraid that that regulation will have even more of an impact on freedom of expression, and that is not the way it should be. We should have requirements for these IT companies.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's a bit difficult to follow what Jimmy Åkesson is saying, because I don't know what he wants me to be responsible for. But I think that the social media, that there needs to be a limit for what you're allowed to say and how you express yourself. That needs to be regulated. I don't think the IT giants, as you put it, that should make these decisions. But what's being decided here is a Digital Service Act, Digital Market Act, which in some way is going to regulate this. And I think it's good that they do that, because just to stand here and say that you must be allowed to say what you want. Well, no, actually, not in every channel. You can go out into the street and say what you want, but it's not a human right to say whatever I want to in social media either. Because that is what leads to the situation that we've seen in the United States. And we might have it, we have a similar situation in Europe and even here in Sweden. It's time to say no, once and for all. We need some order in the social media as well. Thank you. That's the end of that round of rejoinders. Next, we have Annie Lööf from the Centre Party.
Herr talman!
Mr. Speaker, the strategy for protecting the elderly has failed. That was the message from the Coronavirus Commission when it presented its conclusions about a month ago. And this commission establishes that the main reason for the fact that we have seen so many deaths among the elderly, that was the very high spread of the disease in society. And I would like to ask the Prime Minister what he feels about his responsibility for that high level of spread, and exactly what lessons have been learned from that. Thank you, Prime Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Now, the authorities have discussed why is it that Sweden has had such a lot of transmission of the virus compared to our Nordic neighbours. So now Denmark has quite a lot of transmission, and in Ireland they had a better situation, but now has a dramatic rise without the English mutation variant or strand. And the situation differs hugely between countries. Spain, Portugal, for example, they've had completely different course of events when it comes to transmission. We don't know why. Obviously, Sweden has had a stronger transmission. And naturally, in the strategy, the idea was to test and trace as many as we could. And then when there was too high a level of transmission, it was impossible to trace as many as we were able to. But together with the municipalities and the regions of Sweden, we said that testing and tracing is an important part of this.
Mr. Speaker, we've now heard a lot about other people's responsibilities and situations in other countries, but that was not my question. My question takes its starting point in what we've heard from the Coronavirus Commission, what we saw and read a month ago. And they're very clear about the fact that we had a very high level of transmission in society, and that is the reason why Sweden stands out. That is why we have so many deaths within the elderly care. And that is a tragedy. And that is why I'm asking the Prime Minister what he feels about his responsibility for that high level of transmission this spring, and what responsibility has the government now. We have many individuals again who are infected in care homes, hospitals, and they die because of that. A final rejoinder.
Well, as Prime Minister, I have the responsibility for how the government acts, and I support the strategy that we have chosen. I think it's the right one, and it still applies. And we have to try to limit transmission as much as possible. But let me also say that when the Corona Commission of Inquiry said that we need to wait and see, we're in the middle of it. When at the end of this, what has happened and what are the experts going to tell us then? But already today we see that those countries that have had the same type of measures have had different types of transmission, different levels. Why is that? I haven't got all the answers. Well, if you have the answers, Annie Lööf, but Lööf, that's fine. But I mean, the experts don't yet. So let's wait and see for that. And I'm responsible for the actions taken in Sweden, and that's my responsibility. Thank you. Next, that's the end of that rejoinder. Next, we have Nooshi Dadgostar from the Left Party, please.
Herr talman.
Mr. Speaker, the government said early on that the purpose with the Swedish strategy was to protect the elderly. And what the Corona Commission said a month ago was not really about spread in society, transmission in society, but the problems that we have within the elderly care system with the people on hourly employments, private actors, understaffing, chronic problems, which means that it's difficult to isolate those with COVID, for example. And these are facts that we've known for a long time, and I cannot imagine that the government hasn't known about this. But still, you opted for this strategy without combining it. And this is what the Commission says, without combining it with true efforts to do things properly. And what does the government think about your responsibility for so many people dying in our elderly care?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Now, Nooshi is actually pointing at what we've also pointed at a long time now, that the whole welfare system needs to be reinforced, which is why when we took power in 2014, we said that we need to change policies. And we did actually do something together with the Left Party, I would say, during the previous mandate period, with, for example, extra resources to care for the elderly and support for the parties so that they could conclude agreements to do away with the involuntary part-time positions. And I've also said this before the pandemic, that we need to certify the title auxiliary nurse. We also need to raise the level of competence in care for the elderly. We need to allocate more resources. We started that, and we've also got proposals from Barbara Westerholm, for example, how we can have a special contact person for people who have home help. Are we satisfied with that? No, not at all. We need to do more. But these are the type of measures that we need in order to ensure that we do have the world's best care for the elderly.
Mr. Speaker, we have seen cut downs in the elderly care for years, and you have been in government for years as well, and not until now are you about to get started. And you know what the situation is like, so how come the government still continues with this strategy? And now the Prime Minister is appealing to municipalities to not reduce taxes, but the government is actually reducing taxes instead of investing in elderly care. You invest 4 times as much in tax reductions compared to elderly care. And what credibility can the Prime Minister have when appealing to municipalities to do his job? And do you think this is right and proper to prioritize tax reductions instead of helping the auxiliary nurses, the home carers, those who've been working in the elderly care to protect the elderly?
Yes, Mrs. Speaker. Well, I think it's right to prioritise resources and allocate them for the welfare state or system. And we did it together during the last period we were in power, and we did that together with the Left Party. We allocated more resources to the care for the elderly. I think it was about 5,000, more than 5,000 new employees within care for the elderly. So actually, what I'm saying is we're not satisfied with that, but we already started this process. And before the pandemic, before the pandemic, we had started to certify the title auxiliary nurse. We'd also started the work of introducing this special dedicated contact person in the care system. Is that enough? No, it's not, but it's the right course to take, and we need to continue along those lines. Thank you. That's the end of that round of rejoinder. Next, we have Ebba Busch Thor from the Christian Democrats.
Herr talman!
Mr. Speaker, the Coronavirus Commission has presented its first report where it highlights the systematic failures within the elderly care. They also point at the fact that the government has a constitutional responsibility to lead the country and remedy such systematic problems. And the previous government with the alliance parties tried to do something. My party friend Maria Larsson started an investigation into what to do, and the same structural problems were identified back then as we see presented by the Corona Commission today. But then, with the Löfven government, 2014, one of the first things you did was to stop that investigation. The investigators have described this as their work being buried. And I would like to ask the Prime Minister if you regret stopping that investigation.
For me. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Now, care for the elderly is so important that the elderly should feel a sense of security. We need to have skilled staff working there. We need more places, not fewer. And when we took power, we said that we need to change course here, also when it comes to care for the elderly, which is why we also decided to close that inquiry, because we need more resources, which is what we did. We allocated more resources in the last period we were in power. And we need more people. We need to raise the level of competence and skills, which is why we started that work as well. Skills enhancement projects and schemes, for example. We need to also certify the title auxiliary nurse, and we're continuing with that as well. And we also need to show that we need to raise the medical competence within care in homes for the elderly. And we've started doing that, and that means that people who work there, they have good working conditions, etc. Now, this is something that we started and we're continuing to do, working along those lines.
Mr. Speaker, so the Prime Minister says that that work that was being done back then was just abandoned. They haven't even looked at those proposals because the government has felt that their reform would be better. But if that had been the case, we should have seen some results. We have had Stefan Löfven as Prime Minister for 6 years, but nothing has happened. And no one from government has asked those investigators that worked on this then what their conclusions were. They sent on their own initiative a memo to the government, but nothing has happened. And I still wonder how come you were not at all interested in talking to those experts. Have you read their memo? Anyone in the government? Why was this just ignored? We know today that those proposals most likely would have saved lives.
Once again, we needed to change course after 8 years of a non-socialist government which did not prioritise the welfare system, instead prioritised tax cuts. That's what happened. So we decided to change course and also needed to look at what's needed in care for the elderly. We need more places. We need more places in homes. We need more people to work there. We need them to be able to enhance their skills. And people who have home help should have one contact person, not several. And they need to have a continuity in their care. These are the questions that we have dealt with. And these are the questions that we are pursuing. And these are the questions that we see are actually being put into place in order to ensure that we do have the best care for the elderly. And also, we are allocating a historic level of resources to care for the elderly. And we hope that parties regionally, locally, that we use those for care for the elderly and not tax cuts. That's the end of that round of rejoinders. And next we have Johan Persson from the Liberal Party. The floor is yours.
Tack, herr talman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Sweden has a number of significant issues to deal with in society. Once we're through the pandemic, hopefully we can see some light at the end of the tunnel. There are so many measures that we need. Inventory levels for emergency storage, for example, needs to be rebuilt. That's one such thing. Migration is another extensive and complicated issue, and Sweden has been somewhat wobbly over the years. Since the mid-1950s or so, Sweden has had extensive immigration. In many cases for labour purposes, it's been very important. People have been integrated. They've helped to build this country. There have been some derogations. When the old Soviet dictatorship attacked former Yugoslavia, those were various exemptions made. Now we're faced with the need for new legislation, and we are getting strange signals from the government. And here's the question from the Liberals. Does the government intend to implement the proposal from the Migration Commission of Inquiry or something else?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. No, I'm sorry, but I'm not quite sure I understand the question. Do you mean that we're going to carry out these proposals? Yes, and we've invited the Liberals to have a discussion about the design of these proposals. And naturally, based on the work that has been carried out here in the Riksdagen, where all the Riksdagen parties were involved in that work, and that committee was not able to submit a unified proposal, but there were different points that were accepted, etc. Now, that is something that has come to our attention, and we are now working with that and to send it out for referral and to continue along those lines. So, yes, we are continuing with this, and the idea is to implement this proposal and to, or at least to take it to the Riksdag for a vote. Thank you.
Tack, herr talman. Då ska jag förtydliga mig.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Let me make myself clear to the Prime Minister. The Commission of Inquiry had a majority, sort of a majority that moved around a little bit from some of these various points, 20, to improve the situation in Swedish migration policies. Jumping back and forth is something that has been quite shocking to witness, and this is expensive. This is all costly. The Prime Minister admitted at the last debate, for example, that criminality is impacted by the volume of migration if you fail to integrate people. That's the whole point. We see the need for openness as Liberals, but we also need to have a very tough and necessary migration policy for integration to accompany this openness. But the government have now included a number of other messages in this round of referrals. We Liberals, we back the proposals from the inquiry, nothing else. And we have budget cooperation, of course. And if you open up, making it even easier for people without asylum grounds to come to Sweden, for example, it's going to be costly. Thank you. Finally, rejoinder, Prime Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I share Johan Persson's view there about migration. So we're at a level where we can see that people can integrate in our society, and that's the principle that we're working according to, which is why we need a new long-term policy in place, and that's what we're working on. Now, in parallel with that, we also have EU regulations, i.e. that all member states take the same amount of responsibility, and that has been our strategy throughout. And now a proposal is going to be decided on, and we'll hope that that's going to be implemented as quickly as possible. And then we'll have EU legislation, we'll have our new national legislation, and at that point we'll have a more long-term migration policy, and we can see that now this is something that we have faith in. And the Liberals, you've been invited to participate in all this work, and you have decided not to participate in that work yourselves. Thank you. That's the end of that round of rejoinders, and all rejoinders with regard to the Prime Minister. Next, we have Ulf Kristersson from the Moderate Party for his second statement. Thank you.
Herr talman, ett högaktuellt...
Mr. Speaker, now naturally we have a huge problem with our national crisis management capabilities. Corona has really shown that our preparedness is not good. The authorities haven't had good leadership, governance, coordination. Municipalities and regions haven't received the sufficient support. It took the government 9 months to produce a pandemic act, despite the fact that the parliament was prepared to make rapid decisions. The first crisis act wasn't used once even. And in the spring, Sweden was last when it came to extensive testing, despite the fact there was a national responsibility for testing. And still, we have no national tracing app. And in the autumn, the government wasn't aware of the fact that the head of the contingencies agency went to the Canaries, not just once, but twice. Sweden needs a centrally placed national crisis management group was one of the conclusions of the Commission of Inquiry for the Tsunami disaster, which was also introduced by the Alliance government in 2006. But Stefan Löfven in 2014 moved the responsibility to the Department for Legal Affairs, but there's nobody there with an overview. It may be practical for a government who wants to sort of protect itself and the management from information and responsibility, but in a crisis, that is only a bad thing. If I lead the government after the next election, I will introduce a National Security Council reporting directly to the Prime Minister. And in just a few seconds, we'll just get an important question, answer to an important question. Is Stefan Löfven prepared to take back the responsibility for the national crisis management to his own office? Thank you. And we have Stefan Löfven, Nooshi Dadgostar from the Left Party, Johan Persson from the Liberal Party, and Isabella Lövin from the Green Party have requested to make a rejoinder.
Johan, du måste...
Johan, every time I need to adjust this when you've been speaking from this podium, says the Prime Minister. Oh, that's not...
I have got that problem.
Det tror jag nog. Herr talman, jag tror att Ulf Kristersson och jag är överens om att välfärden behöver prioriteras framöver. Och det behövs också då en politisk samsyn för att vi ska behöva ge svensk äldreomsorg, svensk sjukvård, arbetsro och resurser. Men då är ord en sak och handling en annan. Och därför bekymrar jag mig över de prioriteringar ändå som moderater gör i praktiken. För att ska äldreomsorgen få mer personal och bättre villkor, då behöver kommunerna mer resurser. Men det alternativ som Kristersson presenterar, så blir det mindre pengar till kommunerna i år. Eftersom alla era tillskott äts upp av skattesänkningar. Berätta gärna.
Oh, everything we're beaten off by tax cuts. So do explain, please, what happens if the municipalities get less money.
Mindre pengar och
the municipalities aren't receiving less money. Actually, it's not money that's the problem. It's the lack of national leadership. And let me say that I see that Stefan Löfven doesn't want to talk about national crisis preparedness because this is something that is avoided throughout. The problem is that it's a central part of your responsibilities, the responsibilities of a Prime Minister. And I also note that the Prime Minister continues to undermine the conclusions of the Corona Commission of Inquiry. Time and again, he undermines these conclusions that were so important, that it's the level of transmission that has resulted in the number of deaths in care for the elderly, or homes for the elderly rather, both privately run and state run. And you want to prohibit private homes for the elderly. I think before you do that, you should call Uppsala, a municipality where there are 102 places in Social Democrat run Uppsala, and I presume he'll prohibit it immediately.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I take it that Ulf Kristersson chooses not to respond to my question. He's raising a completely different topic instead. We need more resources for municipalities. My opinion is yes, and the municipalities need some breathing space to focus on what they need to do. I don't want to change and privatize in areas that are run by the municipalities during this crisis period. I don't want to see tax cuts. We need to speak with one and a united message and voice to the local level. We prioritise elderly care, also in municipalities led by the moderate party. That's what I want to say. In crisis management, well, there's nothing to boast about for the moderate party. We took over in a situation where the defence of this country was considered to be a special interest. When 500 police officers were trained per year. We've changed all this around. We've raised the level of the armed forces. We've allocated a lot more money for police training. We've strengthened welfare and crisis management with a national crisis strategy that we didn't have at all during your time in office, Ulf Kristersson. Finally, John Ulf Kristersson.
Mr. Speaker, if I were Social Democrat Prime Minister, I would be a bit humble. I mean, from the tsunami disaster to the, not mention the fires, forest fires and the corona, there's a red thread here, that there's a lack of ability to when it comes to handling a crisis. So the answer, your answer, was to do away with the responsibility and take it from the Prime Minister and take it further down the chain of command. And that is irresponsible. But when it comes to Social Democrat leadership in Uppsala with private homes, then they're good. But if they're elsewhere, then they're bad. So, Stefan Löfven, are you going to call the Social Democrat-led regime in Uppsala and ask them to close homes in Uppsala? That's the end of that round of rejoinder. And next we have Nooshi Dadgostar from the Left Party.
Herr talman.
Mr. Speaker, the Corona Commission was severe in its criticism of undermanning, staffing and financing in elderly care. I noted that Ulf Kristersson did not consider that that was the most relevant point. He wanted something else, but this is what the Commission has declared, and to my party this is extremely significant. The people who work in elderly care need to be able to save the elderly people living there. The Left Party negotiated to ensure many millions invested in this area, with an additional 4,000 people working in elderly care who could have been working today. However, when the Moderate Party, together with the Sweden Democrats and the Christian Democrats, were able to push through their budget after the election, the extra support that had been granted to promote elderly care services was done away with. And the year after, we were hit by a pandemic. Ulf Kristersson, was it terribly wise to table a budget, to make a proposal for a budget which drew back on that?
Mr. Speaker, let's have an honest discussion about the Commission of Inquiry on Corona and agree on perhaps what's important here. Now, the overall conclusion was the transmission in the country there. I mean, obviously, if you have a much higher level of transmission, then, of course, you'll have more deaths in care for the elderly. It's a different situation in Norway, that you have less transmission, and there you have fewer deaths in homes for the elderly. That's their conclusion. So, as the Left Party leader said, structural deficiencies in care for the elderly, yes, back to the 90s, yes, those reforms then haven't worked. For example, there's no medical care available in homes like this, and there's manning is another problem. Skills levels are another problem. All this, and the inquiry that Ebba Busch mentioned, they were going to look at that actually, and that was shut down by this government. And you didn't protest then. Now we have to restart everything 6 years later. We may have, in fact, common views here, and I think that this is something we could do together.
Fru talman, Coronakommissionen kom ju med mycket.
Mr. Speaker, the Corona Commission had extensive criticism. Over 300 pages dealt with the elderly care sector. Ulf Kristersson chooses not to talk about this, and I have to agree with Stefan Löfven reluctantly. to Ulf Kristersson to say that Stefan Löfven does not want to discuss the resources to elderly care. I wonder where these resources are. They're always removed in moderate party budgets, I have to put forward here, but that's not enough. The moderate party would like, now in the midst of a pandemic, would like to introduce a second qualifying day for healthcare workers. We know that these qualifying days will create a situation where healthcare and care workers are forced to go to work in spite of feeling unwell in the midst of a pandemic. You're looking to introduce an additional one in above and beyond the savings you're making in your municipalities and in your budget bill proposals. How does that play into the situation right now?
Det där är ju helt fel.
Mr. Speaker, but that's completely wrong. We don't want that. On the contrary, we wanted to do away with those days when you weren't paid sick leave during the corona crisis so that people wouldn't go to work. I mean, we need this otherwise in general when it comes to sick pay insurance. And we know that you're against this, that there are 2 days when people don't get paid when they are ill. But we look at both of the conclusions of the Commission of Inquiry. It was the spread in the society and also that led to the high level of deaths in nursing homes. Now, if the government had dealt with this 60 years ago, we would have seen a very different situation, and so much more remains to be done. And it's not all about more resources. That's the end of that round of rejoinder. And now we have Johan Persson from the Liberal Party.
Tack, herr talman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I share the views expressed by the leader of the Moderate Party about the scourge of criminality. Nothing will do more to ruin the life chances of people than not being able to break the power of the gangs and the criminals. Many can suffer as a result. But it's not enough to be very, very tough in a pact to take on the gangs, pushing the government ahead of us. But we need to work in a preemptive manner as well. And I was very pleased to hear Ulf Kristersson say, believe it was before Christmas, that it was important with preschools focusing on language proficiency. In the situation people are in, which will feed young people into a life of crime. What about other social investments, giving support to make it easier for the municipalities to provide social services when necessary to support these young people? Ulf Kristersson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I agree with you when it comes, for example, other things we have, Liberal Party might have good proposals, and we've stolen some of them. Now, what I said in my Christmas speech, preventative measures is just as important as what you do when something has gone awry, and therefore you need to have the same systematic process, and you have to be just as stubborn and not just talk about a few resources here and there and a leisure centre, etc., or centre for youths. It's about preschool, it's about level of knowledge, it's about parental responsibility. There are so many areas, preventive measures, and another specific area is language. It's one thing that you have adults coming to Sweden have difficulties learning Swedish, but as a child, you need to learn really, really good Swedish so that you can get through school and get a job. That's a real preventative measure. Thank you. Johan Persson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm glad to hear this. A lot of what's done in this respect is done at municipal level, and things look very different from one part of the country to another. When I travel around in this beautiful country of ours, I've traveled significantly less this year, however, but it's often case people who work in schools and social services, they can feel frustrated in marginalized areas where they meet people who work with these youth and children, trying to create a meaningful future for them, not just spare time forever and ever. They say they need so many resources, and the Liberals have stated very clearly that it would be good to have a forceful and thorough investment in suburban areas. of need, and we can turn this around now. If you look at the direction it's going in some of these marginalized areas, it's a gloomy perspective. We've talked about a Marshall Plan, but I think we've agreed on special investment, special focus on these particular marginalized urban areas. If you commit a crime, you need to be locked away and get rehabilitations. No question about that. Finally, General Kristersson.
Mr. Speaker, yes, I can contribute more resources, especially if you do the same time as changing the rules, not just more resources and maintain the rules and regulations. Now, the social service, I've worked with them in many ways, and they are very good at handling difficult problems with small children, really, really good, but not at all equipped to handle a criminal 15-year-old boy, not at all, where you want to take the responsibility from the social services so that they can focus on the children where you can have these traditional measures that can help them, and you use those resources, and so you need to change and transfer that responsibility.
Jättevarsågod.
Herr talman.
Mr. Speaker, the climate crisis is the single greatest challenge of our times. Many large companies have understood this. They have set their own climate targets. They've listened to politics. And in politics, we don't want to lag behind. In Sweden, industrial companies with the largest emissions have ambitions which reflect Sweden's national targets to reduce the emissions by 63% as of 2030. However, the moderate party, who believe to be the friends of big industry, they have a very confusing policy. Ulf Kristersson, can you explain to me why the moderate party are opposed to Sweden pushing forward to ensuring that the EU has as high levels set as Sweden? Why do you only want to reduce the emissions by minus 55% at the EU level? Why do you want to give European industry lower objectives than that of Swedish industry? Why should German steel manufacturers aim for lower objectives than Swedish ones? In which way does this benefit Swedish industry? Ulf Kristersson?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We stand firm. We stick to the objectives we have explained from the beginning. We haven't changed our opinion at all. And if we can get there, that will be a huge step. But let me add that the climate crisis, the climate problem, that is one of the most serious problems today. But we have more. We have the COVID pandemic and we have serious crime. And I do think that those problems are just as large and something that we need to deal with it today. If we cannot deal with these problems that we see every day, then we'll have problems in managing problems that will take much longer and take much more effort. The climate crisis, yes, that is one problem, but we also have COVID and crime.
Lövin.
Isabella Lövin.
Tack, herr talman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, of course, all the scientists of the World General Secretary of the UN, everyone has pointed to the fact that now is when we can do something about the climate crisis, which will otherwise affect every single generation following after us. So we need to have that perspective in mind and take action now. And it is strange to me. The moderate party usually are opposed to the Swedish industry taking the lead, having more ambitious targets than the rest of the world. But now it's strange because you're in fact backing the Swedish climate law, the new Swedish climate legislation, but you want to have less ambitious targets at EU level. It's absolutely impossible to understand. Others want to follow suit, but you want to ask them to slow down. Minus 60% was proposed at EU level. Now you still want Sweden to fight in the Council of Ministers to get minus 55 instead of 60 or 65%, which corresponds to the Swedish targets. It's absolutely impossible to understand in which way does this benefit Swedish industry and the climate transition.
Mr. Speaker, we stick to the agreement that we have concluded that the EU Commission stands behind as well. When it comes to here and now, well, Swedish companies can become role models, but that takes electrification and pure electricity. If we want to do away with nuclear power quickly, we'll reduce access to that cleanest energy mix that is available, and the risk to import dirty electricity is not to serve as a role model. That concludes that set of rejoinders and all rejoinders on that address, and we're going to continue with the next speaker, which is Jimmy Åkesson, Sweden Democrats.
Herr talman.
Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister started his address in this debate to talk about polarization and division. And I think I quote him correctly when I say that polarization and split and division can gain force here as well. Which stone was he sitting under in the past few years, or decades for that matter? That's what I ask myself, because Sweden today is more polarized and divided than it has been in a very, very long time, likely more than ever in modern times. And this is not, Mr. Speaker, due to the fact that people in our country have other opinions than Stefan Löfven, although you might get that impression when Stefan Löfven is speaking. It's down to politics. Very poor prioritizations and the lack of entrenchment in reality of the government. A reality described by the government that many, many people don't recognize as their own. Our country is being polarized and divided because there's absolutely no humility from the government in the face of other people's opinions and stances that do not match the government's. An absolutely irresponsible migration policy for decades. Stefan Löfven is no exception up to at least 2015. This combined with an integration policy without demands and obligations. That's what I would sum up as a policy of division. Toothless, naive legal policies leading to reduced trust in law enforcement and in society as a whole, creating further division. And absolutely incomprehensible prioritizations in politics, where people who've been working hard for many years throughout their life and paid taxes are not given what they reasonably can be expected to receive. And people who recently arrived who've never contributed at all can get lots and lots instead. That's creating division and polarization. Thank you. We have a request for rejoinders from the Prime Minister, Social Democrat, Annie Lööf, Center Party, Martin Auguster of Left Party, one person in the Liberal Party, and Isabella Lövin of the Green Party. Prime Minister, you have the floor.
Tack, herr talman. Först blir väldigt många.
Mr. Speaker, to listen to the Sweden Democrats and Jimmy Åkesson and talking about the pensioners, well, I think this is a bit too much, because he had the idea to introduce a legislation that led to pensioners paying more tax. And yes, democracy has to be protected, but we do not do that with riot fences and police, but with actions and leadership. Another quote, well, choose side and prepare for battle. We could read that on your Twitter account last week, and you wrote in October that we have to prepare for the upcoming elections and to have a war in parliament. That is not really the language of democracy. And you, Jimmy Åkesson, you stand out compared to other party leaders. Do you really think this is right and proper? Jimmy Åkesson.
Mr. Speaker, the old shall fall. It is time for combat. This is the final struggle. I'm pretty confident that Prime Minister Stefan Löfven sings this at least once a year in connection with the celebration of Labor Day, the 1st of May. You need to clean up your own house first, Stefan Löfven. I'm the party leader. Perhaps it's not something worth mentioning, but I represent the party who's lost most elections ever. I have never questioned the election outcomes. I've had no problems with the election results. Stefan Löfven has won 2 elections in a row, and he has made this country more polarized and divided and insecure than ever. Stefan Löfven is a problem. Thank you, Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, Jimmy Åkesson continues to say that it would have been better for the United States and the world if the old president had been given renewed trust to continue to lead the country. And Jimmy Åkesson has himself said that the president lacks many of those characteristics that we feel is part of being human, but you still want him to win. Well, we cannot interpret this in any other way. You're defending the hateful rhetorics of Donald Trump and this extreme polarization that we see in society, that we have seen during his presidency. And this is totally disrespecting democracy, because democracy is built on values and demonstrated through action. And that goes for Sweden as well. Final rejoinder, Jimmy Åkesson.
Stefan Löfven, Mr. Speaker, also said in his address earlier today that you should avoid to throw lies at your opponents. And you could reasonably then expect, as a politician, and in particular if you're the Prime Minister and head of government in this country, perhaps not every time in each debate will need to misinterpret everything that your political opponents say. But Stefan Löfven is a master of that skill. I'd say he's the Swedish champion of misinterpreting what others have said. I do not believe that neither the US society and our part of the world, which is impacted greatly by what happens in the US, will benefit from a left liberal policy which will increase immigration, would like to allow more illegal immigration, decriminalize illegal immigration, and would like in various ways to have an absolutely absurd environmental policy which will cost billions and billions and billions, Mr. Speaker. And that's what I'm talking about, not about individuals. Thank you. That concludes this round of rejoinder. Annie Lööf of the Centre Party has the floor for the next round of rejoinders.
Herr talman!
Mr. Speaker, the pandemic has impacted severely our Swedish companies, particularly restaurants. We've heard from their umbrella organization that some 5,000 individuals have been given notice or terminated, and many restaurateurs have seen their businesses destroyed. And in the middle of this crisis, you want to increase the VAT on restaurants with some 14 billion krona, according to your budget proposal. That should start now, beginning of the year. And how do you think that that is safeguarding Swedish jobs and companies, increasing VAT with 14 billion in one of the most severely impacted sectors in the midst of a crisis? How can you be so tone deaf when it comes to the needs of companies? Jimmy Åkesson.
Mr. Speaker, well, it's not quite that simple, of course. A budget is not just one item. It consists of a number of different items, and we have, in addition, also made a number of proposals that will make it easier for people to consume, to buy things, to be consumers. So, to be perfectly honest, Mr. Speaker, I don't think that's particularly relevant. When you talk about VAT, Annie Lööf, and you link this to the opportunities for jobs and the labour market, I believe that Annie Lööf could give me, she should give me an answer of how the policies worked out when they reduced the restaurant VAT, how many jobs were created. I don't think any jobs were created, because that's not the crucial point, and in particular not in the midst of this pandemic. This is about physical possibilities for people to consume and all, to be able to go to a restaurant. And if people can't go out and eat in restaurants, it doesn't really matter how the VAT on restaurants is devised. Annie Lööf.
Mr. Speaker, this is very interesting. What we hear from Jimmy Åkesson, he cannot see the value in reducing costs for small companies. He sees no value in reducing costs, that it does not matter for creating jobs, but of course it does. And it's also interesting what you say about these so-called helicopter money, where we have a cost of some 82 billion, and that does very little. The Sweden Democrats, you want to reduce the employers' contributions, and that should be temporary. But this proposal to increase VAT on restaurants, you want to increase that permanently. And I wanted to ask what you think about these struggling owners of small companies. How can it help them to increase taxes with 14 billion? Because this is money that they have to pay in the midst of a crisis, and that is not taking responsibility. That is showing contempt for Swedish companies. Jimmy Åkesson.
Mr. Speaker, the small businesses in Sweden and other hard-working small operators will be impacted by changes. We're removing some of the general pay obligations. We're reducing the need for employers to cover some of the sick pay. Many of the measures that are highly in demand by businesses, small businesses. They're not asking for lower restaurant VAT. It's not intended, first of all, to reduce the cost for individual operators. They're reducing the cost for the people who are paying for the food. Myself and Annie Lööf, when we go out for a meal in a restaurant. So did the food get cheaper so that you stimulate demand? After the government, Annie Lööf was part of, introduced the measure. No, it didn't. Did it create more job opportunities? No, it didn't either. Secondly, that's the problem. The alliance government reduced the VAT. We want to restore it because it was a measure that lacked in efficiency. But nobody can question our measures for small and medium-sized companies. Thank you. That concludes this round of rejoinders. And now it's Nooshi Dadgostar who has the floor for the next round of rejoinders for the Left Party.
Herr talman.
Mr. Speaker, in the middle of the corona COVID crisis, we have elderly care where many individuals have died. Every single case is a human being, someone beloved, a grandparent, and many of them died alone without a relative there. And in the Finance Committee, we have had a proposal where we wanted to invest billions in elderly care, to increase the staffing, to have more permanent employment, to help and save people. The Sweden Democrats were against. They voted against, so we couldn't make this big investment in elderly care. And we hear a lot from you, but we see very, very little action. You just wanted to make more and more cutbacks in elderly care. And how, Jimmy Åkesson, can you defend this, that in the middle of the COVID crisis you stop this proposal? Jimmy Åkesson.
Mr. Speaker, more money for elderly care is something we've proposed in every single budget proposal we've introduced in this chamber. And I believe it's very important for the municipalities to be given more resources so that they can prioritise elderly care. Because just as Nooshi Dadgostar points out correctly in a previous round of rejoinders, it is often the elderly care, in fact, that has to step back when the municipalities are asked to make savings in their budgets. And it's an enormous problem. But right now, the problem is not perhaps to employ more people, more workers in panic in the elderly care sector. The problem in this pandemic has been getting people who can't understand Swedish to comply with basic hygiene procedures and having too high a turnover of workers in elderly care and the lack of skilled nursing and healthcare competence. That's not resolved by the left-wing party's proposals. I'd like to invest lots of money in everything that's nice and pretty, but it has to also have a benefit. Otherwise, it's not worth it.
Mr. Speaker, the Sweden Democrats will look at all those municipalities where they're in power. There they talk about no more resources being needed, not for elderly care. They need to do lots of things, but they're not to have any more resources. We see that in all of your municipalities, Bromölla, Hörby, Sölvesborg, where you're in power. The same thing with cutbacks. For example, these old people do not get hot but cold food. You do not have people there during night. You privatize and you give contracts to poor actors and you reduce employment security. And we see this in one municipality after another where you're in power. But what we've seen now is that you've you prevented this huge investment into elderly care, where we could have had more permanent employments, where we could have saved more of the elderly. Why did you have to stop that? Jimmy Åkesson.
Sverigedemokraterna.
Mr. Speaker, the Sweden Democrats, unfortunately, has never been in power in this country. Now, in actual terms, the left party hasn't either, but they've had real influence, not least during periods of social democratic governments. And it is somewhat surprising that elderly care, in spite of the exceptionally excellent policies of the left-wing party, that it is so lagging behind. I could reasonably not be held responsible. It is the left-wing party and other governments and supporting parties of previous governments that have shaped the current elderly care. I didn't. I can only regret the situation. Year in and year out, I've pointed to a number of shortcomings in elderly care, not least when it comes to available resources. But what Nooshi Dadgostar is raising here is about adding additional resources here and now. I have no problem with doing that. But it's not first and foremost about adding resources. It's about resolving more long-term structural problems that are inherent to the sector, and which has meant that many people have been forced to an early death. Probably not necessarily. Thank you. That concludes this round of rejoinder, and Johan Persson of the Liberal Party has the floor for the next round of rejoinders.
Tack, herr talman. Ja, det här sista.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, this is Alice in Wonderland. I wanted to talk about polarization and how important it is to solve real problems, because that is what feeds into extremism, where people feel that nothing happens with these basic problems in society. But now we see that we have had several agreements, collaborations, for example, in the Finance Committee to present budget proposals, not the least when it comes to money that is given to Swedish regions and municipalities. You actually do have a collaboration. The Sweden Democrats and the Social Democrats de facto work together in Parliament today. But my question was, or had to do with solving problems. We need to focus on jobs, integration, reduce polarization, etc. And here we also need to look at tax money. We need to reduce taxes for companies. But Jimmy Åkesson also wants all this money, 82 billion, that are to be given to everyone, all citizens, without looking at what income is that.
Förslaget.
Mr. Speaker, yes, I think so. Otherwise, we wouldn't have put forward that proposal. But I think it's because we've ended up in this situation because everybody throughout this crisis has spoken about the need to allocate extraordinary resources here in Sweden to restart Sweden. And here we are demanding, extraordinary resources. And I mean, what others have said is just the old traditional things, sort of deduction here and reduction there. But that's not a restart for Sweden where we need to kickstart the economy. No, a kickstart for the economy in Sweden would, for example, be that every single citizen in our country receives a bag of money in order to go out and consume. Spend 10,000 kronor. Why not? Go to your local restaurant or stores or whatever, in order to save companies, quite simply, and save jobs. And I think that's much, much more efficient and effective than these long-term structural changes that everybody keeps talking about here in this chamber. It may resolve things in the long term, but not when we need to kickstart the economy.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, the Liberal reserves themselves the right to work in a structured manner long term, and we do need to reduce taxes for companies, especially small companies. And if we look at corporate taxes, well, that's something we have, and we need to have a tax on personal bonds so that people can invest. It's so important for small companies, but it's also important to have big companies and to allow them to grow more tech companies, more Spotify, more Klarna. And here we need to focus on reduced taxes because we want them to invest in Sweden. And we also need to have a proper education, world class. And I think that we can make better use of our resources. And Jimmy Åkesson and Johan Persson, well, for us to get 10,000 krona so that we can go shop or eat at a restaurant, well, that is not really beneficial if we increase VATs, for example. Thank you, Jimmy Åkesson.
Man var det väl en logisk kullerbytta.
Now, really, that was a bit of a strange logic there. But anyway, once again, the structural proposal, I buy a lot of them. Yes, of course, if we had a good corporate climate, reduce taxes for companies, make it easy for them to employ people. But that's not what's going to kickstart our economy later, is it? I was saying that we're going to reduce, taxes here, tax cuts there for people in the low-income bracket, as people have said. Well, that's fine, a couple of 100 kronor extra a month, but that's nothing that's going to help us restart the economy. Yes, for the long term, it's fantastic, but not something that's going to restart our economy. And we are the only party in this Riksdagen that has put forward a restart budget. And you can have different views about whether it's efficient and effective or not, but but money that you receive in this way, you tend to spend to a much larger extent that people won't save that money. So for short term, when we want to restart the economy, that's fantastic. Because not for long term, but I think as a kickstart measure, I think that's a good proposal. That's the end of that round of rejoinders. Next is Isabella Lövin from the Green Party. The floor is yours.
Fru talman.
Madam Speaker, the other day I was listening to Jimmy Åkesson and he said that he probably would prefer Donald Trump being the president, in spite of him refusing to acknowledge the result and in spite of what happened at the Capitol with the chants that they should hang the vice president. And the reason why he prefers Donald Trump is that he is closer to the conservative ideas where the Sweden Democrats feel at home. And I would like to know what conservative ideas, being against abortions or leaving the Paris Agreement, denying the climate problem, or not having health insurance for everyone, or talking about media as fake news. What ideas are so good that you feel that they are more important than what has happened the last few days? Jimmy Åkesson.
Fru talman, jag tycker att det är lite anmärkningsvärt.
Madam Speaker, I think it's a bit odd. I mean, okay, I can answer that question. If you're really interested, though, you can read my Facebook page there. I've been very clear on those points. But it's a bit odd, I would say. That, here we have two government parties, and both of their party leaders have stood here today talking about completely different things than things that actually have to do with their failures, their mistakes. Also something that's happening elsewhere in the world, somewhere completely different. And to be perfectly honest, I think that the electorate in Sweden expect them to take measures with regard to their own remit as well. People are being shot in our streets and children being raped. People are dying because they are not getting the care that they deserve and should have. And I would like to ask both these parties who are in government to talk about why do they talk about that? Why do they instead want to talk about an election across the Atlantic? It's not reasonable. Isabella Lövin, rejoinder.
Jag noterade att Jimmy Åkesson.
Well, thank you, Madam Speaker. I've noted that Jimmy Åkesson spends a lot of time talking about Trump and other opinion makers and their rights to write whatever on Twitter, write disinformation. But at the same time, Jimmy Åkesson has said that we should do away with the radio channel P3 because it's crap. And we've also heard the Sweden Democrats talk about someone as the enemy of the nation. And we know that the undermining of free media and facts, we know that things can spread, and we've seen how a spark can ignite something. And we see an undermining of democracy. And what responsibility do you feel you have when it comes to avoiding the spread of disinformation from your party group? What is your responsibility as a member of an opposition party?
Jimmie Åkesson, Sverigedemokraterna. Varsågod.
Ja, fru talman, 1.
Madam Speaker, 1. Opinions which aren't in line with the Green Party or the Social Democrats or Isabel Lillen aren't always about disinformation. I think that's very important to say. Secondly, Isabel Lillen, where are you and your Green Party or your government, really, when left-wingers tried to storm the White House in the summer? Or when left-wingers occupied the Senate a couple of years ago when they were going to swear in a new judge in the Supreme Court. Where was your indignation at that time? I mean, really, it's so hypocritical. I mean, I can't even believe my ears. Free media, how can you say that it's free and free media that when you have individual multinational companies, corporate managers in a different part of the world can close a Swedish web newspaper? It's very odd that the government doesn't react more strongly to that because it affects us all. Thank you. That's the end of that round. And next is Annie Lööf.
Fru talman,
Madam Speaker, the events in Washington last week shows us what we have in this xenophobic populism and that well-grounded rhetorics, violence, threats and disrespect for democracy and the open societies. We have this movement in Sweden as well, and they mean what they say, and that is why it's so important to understand that we have to say that we cannot have Donald Trump. We have to work for open societies with a democracy, to not keep silent, to not be neutral, to not take a stance, but instead stand up for the rule of law, democracy, stand up against aggressive right-wing populists. This is so important. We have to safeguard the liberal democracy, that's obvious, but we also need to take Sweden out of the COVID pandemic. We need to do everything we can, and we need to use the new Pandemic Act efficiently. We need to vaccinate as many as possible and protect risk groups. We have to ensure that our companies survive the crisis, that they get the support that they are entitled to here and now so that we can save people's jobs. And all of this takes a clear leadership where we are not afraid to act, but instead we need more of us who are willing to take that extra step and go one step in front of others instead of behind others. We need to do that to get us through this crisis, to defend liberal democracy. We cannot just be a neutral spectator. We need to build Sweden as a strong, green, industrious country. Thank you. And here we have Nooshi Dadgostar and Ebba Busch who have asked for rejoinders. Please.
Oj. Fru talman.
Madam Speaker, the Corona Commission of Inquiry directed a lot of criticism with regard to the weak working conditions in care for the elderly, that so many people in home help and in nursing homes have temporary contracts, which means that the transmission of corona has spread hugely, and that's why many more people have died. It's difficult, for example, to go on sick leave when you have that kind of temporary contact. It means that more and more people have to, or are the ones who visit people in their homes to help them. And we know that Annie Lööf, one of her her main focus is to ensure that working conditions in Sweden deteriorate. So now the Commission of Inquiry really is very, very clear here on this point, that the government ensures that the employers improve the working conditions of the employees in the care for the elderly. So what are you, the Centre Party, going to do for these employees?
Madam Speaker, this is key, as a matter of fact, and we're not just looking ahead. We've also done a lot. We need more permanent contracts in the elderly care, and that is why we, together with the government, has carried out work where we have invested specific money in making sure that, for example, auxiliary nurses get permanent employment. This is very important in order to upgrade those jobs and also to invest in these individuals, to invest in safety and security in elderly care. Something else that is important is the possibility to make a career within the healthcare profession, that you can continue with the training if you're an auxiliary nurse, a nurse, for example. We've invested here as well, and we share a responsibility. Parliament, municipalities, regions, and also employers have to make sure that we do what we can.
Madam Speaker, I know that Annie Lööf, not even with one word, actually said what the party stands for, and that is that job security is to be deteriorated. And throughout this period of government, it's all been about a deterioration of job security. This is one of your focus areas. And what this has done is, in care for the elderly, for example, we've had much greater transmission that we would have needed to have. And I see no self-criticism from the Centre Party, which is very serious. Are we going to continue along these lines or not? And we also know that density and population density and living very closely together, for example, many people in one flat, it's difficult to keep a distance from each other, which may have meant that more people have been affected, and especially people in the care sector. But still, the Centre Party would like to put forward a proposal to strongly increase the rent for people who live in rental accommodation in Sweden. Is that really the path forward for Sweden? Thank you. Final rejoinder, Annie Lööf, Centre Party.
Madam Speaker, I've actually answered this question as well. Maybe that was not the answer you wanted, but I can tell you what I think about labour law as well, and the negotiations that we have had there about employment security. And what we've come to as a conclusion is that it's important that you work with additional training, for example, and that is also why we have the trade unions on board, because they feel it's important. And this also means that you cannot make use of temporary employments for too long, but you have to offer permanent employment. And this is also part of the negotiations that the parties have had and what we are now going to see through. And that is what it is about, flexibility for small companies and at the same time more safety security for the employees. Thank you. And that concludes that set of rejoinders, and we continue with Ebba Busch.
Fru talman.
Madam Speaker, now the last few years in Swedish politics, we've really seen two different courses and lines when it comes to forestry and green business. On the one hand, we have the Christian Democrats and the Moderate Party, where we want to see the state to give greater possibilities to own a plot of land and forest. And we see this is an important part of our climate work. On the other hand, we have the red-green government, where we want to ban the use of forest to a tune of 250 billion kronor. So that's every sixth job in the forestry sector is threatened. And then there was also the issue of the EU classification of bioenergy as non-viable when it comes to it being energy friendly. So, Annie Lööf, are you going to support this government with its forestry policy, or are you going to join us? Thank you, Annie Lööf.
Madam Speaker, I welcome what you say about forestry and green industries. This is something that we have wanted to see for decades. We have to have a proper forestry policy, and we have often been alone in this battle here in Sweden and also at European level, where we have stood up for that need to use forest properly to get the bioeconomy going, to have more biofuels so that we use without using everything. And this is where we have to work with freedom and responsibility in combination. It's also about ownership rights. And I'm aware of the proposals that have been presented. This was something very important for the left party in the January agreement, I know. And we are going to make better use of the Swedish forests. Eva Busch.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Now, I do know that the Centre Party focuses on forestry. We do as well, even if, of course, healthcare and care for the elderly is perhaps a bit more important. But because we know your involvement when it comes to the forestry sector, that's why I put the question to you. Because I'm genuinely surprised as to why the Centre Party has allowed this and has not gained sufficient guarantees that this government will not continue with this animosity vis-à-vis the forestry sector and the green businesses. And Annie Lööf, and your spokesperson, says that the government is unwilling to react to save the forestry sector in Sweden, and we have this commission of inquiry, which is a real threat to the forestry sector. So where does the limit go? I mean, last week and this week, it's been very unclear. So are you going to put a stop to this? Thank you. That's the end of that round of rejoinders. So, Annie Lööf.
Madam Speaker, the Centre Party has accomplished very important in the January agreement, which is that we're to protect biotopes, we're to look at ownership of forests, all these components that we have talked about in media and also presented proposals in Parliament. We've also had the government starting an inquiry, and we're not going to contribute to anything that goes against the January agreement. I only negotiate once. And here we have clear benefits for Swedish forestry, and the government will now have to deliver. Thank you. That concludes that set of rejoinders, and we continue with the next speaker, Nooshi Dadgostar from the Left Party.
Fru talman.
Madam Speaker, now we've heard both the government and the non-socialist party, that they do understand the suffering caused by this crisis. But why is nobody prepared to do something about it? Why is nothing happening here and now? Being prepared for future crises must entail that the care sector in all our cities and towns, that they are so robust that they are able to handle a situation like a pandemic. High level of manning, permanently employed staff, fewer companies, and we can see that in the middle of a pandemic, we saw that caregivers had to travel on the tube, in buses, for too many people within the care sector, especially for the elderly. This crisis was so difficult for them because many of the elderly died without a close relative by their side, and the care sector employees had to fight themselves for PPE. And despite the fact that many were ill, they still went to work. And the government and the other parties has said no and no time and again to our proposals to do something about this. So what has the government done? What has been done to ensure that care sector workers weren't going to be affected on their way to work or home? So what happens when there are so many different private businesses running nursing homes, for example, how can we ensure that we have enough employees working in the sector? What was done to ensure that both the care sector, the health sector had sufficient PPE? What was done in order to reduce the number of part-time employees? It's still the elderly who are being affected in our nursing homes. There are still threats when it comes to cuts in the care sector and the healthcare sector. We need to take action to prevent something of the same happening again in Sweden. Thank you very much. Annie Lööf has requested a rejoinder, and Johan Persson from the Liberal Party. Let us start with Annie Lööf from the Centre Party. The floor is yours.
Oj, vad långt. Fru talman, några av dem...
Madam Speaker, some of the worst crimes against humanity has been committed by communism. Millions of people have been killed and oppressed. But in spite of the dark history of communism, the left party appears to find it difficult to condemn the Venezuela is praised. Cuba is praised in demonstrations and protests regularly, and many of the members refer to themselves as communists openly. So it was quite interesting when in the Radio P1 Saturday interview, Nooshi Dadgostar was asked if she's a communist. She said she doesn't refer to herself as a communist, but rather a left-wing party member, but couldn't state anything that she would criticize communism for. Now I'd like to give her a new chance after she was interviewed in public service radio. What is wrong with communism?
Madam Speaker, I think it's a shame that Annie Lööf has chosen to misinterpret me in that interview. That is not true at all. I was very clear on that point. In fact, I joined the Left Party long after the Left Party left that type of political ideology and fantasies. I did so because I safeguard human rights, freedom of expression, and all these important parts of a democratic country. I will always support those ideas. I'll do it in Sweden and in the whole world. Annie Lööf, you should be happy about that. Thank you. Thank you, Annie Lööf.
Fru talman,
Madam Speaker, but to leave something you've inherited behind you, it appears to be a very sensitive topic, nevertheless, because it's quite simple. It's quite simple, an easy question, my one. In the radio interview, it was quite a simple question, and I didn't hear an answer now either. What is wrong with communism? She didn't reply in the radio interview, nor did she give us an answer now. And here's what I'm thinking. There are a number of representatives in the Left Party who consider themselves and call themselves communism. If you are opposed to communism, what do you think about the fact that other representatives in the same party openly label themselves communists? Thank you. Final rejoinder. Nooshi Dadgostar.
Madam Speaker, I don't agree with what you're saying here. The Left Party left that behind it a long time ago, and I joined the party long after that. And just as I said, I have been very clear with this, that I will never accept any violations when it comes to the freedom of expression, for example. I will never accept any violations of human rights or any infringements on human rights, which is why I joined the Left Party. And I know that the 500,000 people who vote for the Left Party have also believe that. That's why they vote for the Left Party. So do show respect for those many people who vote for the Left Party, because they want more investments in the welfare sector, job security, better housing, better climate policy. That's what we represent. And I do think that you, Annie Lööf, you need to show that it's good that we can agree on those issues and not always try to. Well, thank you. That was the end of that round of rejoinders. Next, Johan Persson from the Liberal Party.
Tack, fru talman.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I just want to tie in with what's been said already on the elderly care. That's one area where we need to see change after the pandemic. Our approach to how to take best care of our elderly and most fragile citizens. The Liberal Party are of the opinion that we would like to hire medical doctors in care services. Is that something that the Left Party could support? And if we want good quality and good resources, we can pay good salaries and provide further education, and the special focus and investment on the elderly care that we are favouring, I'm very much in favour of a good availability of tax funds. And so the Swedish industry is a very important component. And here's my question to the Left Party. What's your opinion on the fact that we find it difficult to provide electricity for the entire country? We have a lack of capacity and efficiency, and investments are suffering. Nooshi Dadgostar with the Left Party.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I'm very glad that you mentioned that, Johan Persson, about the care for the elderly and care homes, and I agree that we need to invest more in these homes and also in skills enhancement for people working in these homes, because it's not easy to work with the elderly and people who have dementia, for example. The municipalities need, for example, more authority to be able to they employ and recruit. Now, as regards Swedish industry, the Left Party will never pursue a policy which threatens the jobs that we have in our industry, all the important things that our industry does for this, because this country is built on industry, hydroelectric power, forests, etc., which is why we would not get stuck in obsolete and old-fashioned expensive electricity. We instead need to invest in renewables instead to ensure that we can have a strong industry also in the future. Thank you. Johan Persson.
Bra ingång.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Good starting point. It is essential to the Liberals that when we get through the pandemic, eventually electrification and automation are the most important points, together with electricity producing to pay for our electrified roads and transition and take the final step away from a fossil society to become climate neutral and hopefully even negative emission levels. We need to have good electricity production, and so solar is important, wind is important, but Swedish nuclear also needs to be given a chance to develop and take on a modern form, in a modern version. It's important for the availability of electricity. Electricity is part of welfare. It's important to healthcare, to the elderly care. We don't want our elderly to freeze. We want them to be served hot meals. So the Left Party needs to reassess their approach to how we produce electricity, which is efficient and good for the environment. Nooshi Dadgostar, finally, John.
Madam Speaker, Johan Persson's problem is that reality has run past him, as it were. Now we see development going in the direction of renewables. That is the future, in fact, and we can see that nuclear power is too old, far too expensive, and suddenly we'll end up in a situation where it won't be able to supply electricity to our industry because we've lost in this and we haven't invested in the future. And I think it's also important for households as well, because electricity prices have increased substantially, and this is the the privatization that we've done on the electricity grid, for example. And I think we need to have a ceiling, for example, for the fixed charge, because now we have a situation where major companies, major corporations take out huge fees from just ordinary households, from, a house in the suburbs to a house in a small town, whatever, because that is what's most important for households and also for industry. Thank you. That's the end of that round of rejoinders. And next speaker is Ebba Busch.
Fru talman.
Madam Speaker, the first conclusion of the Corona Commission partial report follows like this. The single most important factor behind the large number of people who've died in elderly care is the generalized community spread. The shortcomings pointed to and identified by the Commission were the reason why we appointed the major commission of inquiry into the elderly care 6 years ago. All these factors, we wanted them to work on precisely the points identified by the Corona Commission, but we lost the election in 2014 and the Social Democratic-led government closed down this commission of inquiry without even avail themselves of its work. These are not just numbers. These are individuals, somebody's mother, father, grandfather, grandmother. It is on their behalf that we have to ask ourselves the question, why was this commission closed down and what was done instead? Stefan Löfven justifies the close down with the need to refocus, but they didn't change direction. They pulled the brakes on reforms and very little has happened since. It's a 6-year-long betrayal of Sweden. The rapidness with which the minister stepped into the press conference of the Corona Commission had been needed, that swiftness. We now see promises of improvements after the next general election is something we would have liked to see much sooner, and it could have been in place already if the government had only wanted to. Stefan Löfven tells us that the elderly care needs more money. We have in our shadow budgets allocated a lot more money than the Social Democrats have in their budget bills. You've heard us Christian Democrats over the years. You know who's always going to get back to the issue of our elderly and elderly care. And the elderly people of this country, they know where we stand. The question is, where do the rest of you stand? Thank you. The Prime Minister Stefan Löfven of the Social Democrats, Annie Lööf of the Centre Party, Nooshi Dadgostar Left Party and Isabella Lövin Green Party have asked for rejoinders, starting with the Prime Minister Stefan Löfven of the Social Democrats. You have the floor.
Tack, fru talman.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. The Christian Democrats might be in opposition at the national level, but they are in fact leaders in many municipalities, which means that the Christian Democrats do in fact have a lot of opportunity and possibility to make decisions and make a difference for people in their everyday lives, not least responsibility for care for the elderly around about the country. Now, that's 40 billion kroner in totally 40 billion kroner that needs to be paid to reinforce the welfare sector. Now, in municipalities like Huddinge and Danderyd, and many more than that, the Christian Democrats want to see tax cuts instead and/or refrain from investing in care for the elderly. Now, is that taking responsibility for care for the elderly? Ebba Busch?
Ebba Busch, Kristdemokraterna, varsågod.
Tack så mycket, fru talman.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. The answer is it depends on the outcome for the elderly, because it is the content and the actual reality for the elderly person that we provide elderly care, and that's the decisive factor. I have understanding of the choice by some municipalities to reduce taxes because we know that they can then benefit low-income earners and families with children, as opposed to the tax reduction policy by the government, who are only focused on those with who are the highest income earners. We've proposed more for the elderly care than the Stefan Löfven government, and we've also proposed more along the lines of reform, improving the working conditions for the people who work in the elderly care, clear national governance to avoid the mixed manning systems and having the right number of employees per manager, etc. But you said no to national investments to change part-time to full-time. Stefan Löfven.
Thank you. Now, your problem, Ebba Busch, is that from the state, we ensure that we allocate resources and help to the municipalities for them to use them in the welfare sector. But in certain municipalities, you refrain from investing and go for tax cuts instead. Now, in Riksdagen, for example, increasing manning throughout care for the elderly and doing away with part-time, and also increasing training as well. And at the same time, they've also done away with shared jobs as well, and increased resources to home help, and increased the number of, or recruited more staff to the care sector. Now, these are priorities which are being done in the here and now and making a difference to people in their everyday lives, Do you think that's a good thing, Ebba Busch? Something to do elsewhere?
Inga problem, fru talman. Tack så mycket för ordet.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. No problem. The short reply to that question from the Prime Minister is yes. Many of the reforms are excellent. But here's what I'm wondering. Can the Prime Minister finally now envisage a tougher national control of elderly care? Earmark the money allocated. Make it impossible for local councillors, whatever political party they belong to transfer the money to local swimming pools or what have you, or to make tax cuts that are not justified in the current pandemic situation where there's a lack of resources in elderly care and health care. That national control and guidance should have been initiated 6 years ago. Rather, Stefan Löfven chose to just bury the Commission of Inquiry, which wanted to propose concrete reforms that were needed back then. It would have been desperately needed during the pandemic, but it's been shelved until after the next general election. This is a betrayal of the elderly people of this country. Thank you. That concludes this round of rejoinders, and the next round of rejoinder is with Annie Lööf, who has the floor for the Centre Party.
Fru talman, det gångna året...
Madam Speaker, this last year we had many surprises. One was that Ebba Busch said that she was against to develop the deduction for domestic services, for example. And in her Christmas address, we also heard what had been the constraints of freedom in Värnamo. The Christian Democrats had a financial policy proposal that was somewhat surprising. A tax on margin taxes, for example, and how is this right-wing policy to be against more and stronger companies and the fact that people who work hard should have more money left? Ebba Busch.
Tack, fru talman. Det är det inte.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. It isn't. This is good right-wing policy in the economical aspects. The criticism has to do with the fact that the Centre Party supports a government which does not have a sustainable plan for how to ensure that the law and good order is complied with everywhere in Sweden. And it goes without saying that at national level there was too much spent in previous governments solely on reforms of the economy, for example, such as domestic services. The RUT deduction for domestic home services was correct, but we also see that the Centre Party in budget negotiations tend to fall back with too much emphasis on certain types of reforms in that area and less focus on healthcare and care sector reforms. Värnamo, where we are in the local government, and many other places in Sweden have been badly affected because these other policy areas are not emphasized enough.
Fru talman, efter Ebba Buschs exposé.
Madam Speaker, after having heard about these shortcomings of the government, well, we end up in Värnamo, where we have the Centre Party and the Christian Democrats having been in government successfully for decades. And you attacked that in your Christmas address, and that didn't really lead to any applause because reduced taxes and sound corporate policy has strengthened that region for decades. And I do think that we can have a right-wing policy and safeguard welfare at the same time. That is what we're doing in our budget. We're reducing with 30 billion taxes on companies, and we're also investing in welfare. And evidently, we do not longer share the opinion that you can conduct a good financial right-wing policy and invest in welfare at the same time, because now you do not want to have these reforms that will help companies, for example. So how can this be good right-wing financial policy? Thank you. Ebba Busch.
Jag tror att det finns en anledning till att vi sett.
I believe that there are reasons why we've seen more and heard more from the forces to the left in Swedish policies, because those who are intellectually honest and choose not to misunderstand people have chosen now to do just that, to seek conflict. I think that Annie Lööf understands perfectly well that my point regarding Värnamo was that the issue at stake there is that there's been too much focus on financial reform and not enough on legal policies. Please, I'll refer you back so that you can read my Christmas speech again. I praised the cooperation and I'm happy to do so again, for entrepreneurship and investments and focus on civil society. But at national level, there's no doubting the fact that the Centre Party continues to focus way too much on financially focused reform, such as home tax deductions for home services, rather than locking up criminals, for example, and that is affecting Värnamo badly. Thank you. That concludes this round of rejoinder. And the next speaker for a round of rejoinders is Nooshi Dadgostar of the Left Party. You have the floor.
Fru talman, de äldre i Stockholm.
Madam Speaker, the elderly in Stockholm have been severely impacted during this COVID pandemic, many of them in care homes and using elderly care. And you're in charge of that. Before the pandemic, the Christian Democrats had made cut downs in these sectors with some 100 billion in 2 years. And you also reduced the requirement of having permanent employment in home care services. And you've also tried to prevent people from having proper locker rooms and clothes so that they can change to new clothes if there is contamination. And now, after a pandemic and after the government having sent big money to Stockholm, the Christian Democrats have been forced to agree to give a bit extra to elderly care. And this is a care scandal. Many have died in Stockholm. And how come we have these huge cutbacks when you decide? Ebba Busch.
Thank you. It hasn't, and I'll repeat that it is the content, the actual result, which is decisive to an elderly person. We've seen this over and over again. You need to combine monetary investment with reforms to change working methods. There are shortcomings. There are problems in all municipalities, including in municipalities where we are part of the local government. I have no problem laying that out. That goes for Stockholm as well. However, we know that the major reason why so many of our elderly have been affected is due to the national strategy, or rather the lack of a national strategy and political decisions to go with it. It was an intentional choice to permit a higher degree of spread in Sweden of the virus than in other countries, believing incorrectly that we would be able to manage. That falls heavily on the shoulders of the government. Nooshi Dadgostar.
Madam Speaker, Ebba Busch wants to combine these investments with other things, but we do not see any major investments. 160 million krona in cutbacks over 2 years. That is a lot. And here in Stockholm, there has also been a lot of criticism for how the pandemic was managed. Nothing was done initially where there was a need to look at the schedules and minimize the number of people who worked with home care. And then we had the contagion into care homes, and there we needed to isolate the elderly so that staff do not move between those who have the virus and those who do not, because that is where we see a spread. And it took at least 6 weeks before that decision to be made to have specific COVID teams, and then it didn't happen because there was no proper follow-up. And what is your responsibility for those many deaths? Ebba Busch.
Thank you. Well, we have an extensive investigation over 300 pages that has come to the conclusion that the fact that so many died in elderly care is directly linked to the fact that at national level a strategy was chosen which permitted a lot more community spread of the virus. I've no problems admitting that we could have done more and better in many municipalities where we are part of the local government. But in Stockholm, during the first half of March, they introduced a complete ban on visits to care homes, in spite of the fact that they refused to do this at national level. And they also introduced special COVID teams in home care services, what the Left Party did at national level when we stated publicly that we should all shake hands, all the parties in this chamber, in this house, and allocate money to allow all the operators to transform hourly employment to fixed employment, is that you turned our offer down in the midst of a pandemic. Thank you. That concludes the round of rejoinder. Isabella Löfven from the Green Party is the next speaker for round of rejoinders. You have the floor.
Fru talman.
Madam Speaker. Due to conflict, climate change and the pandemic, we're now in a global crisis where some 100 million individuals have had to flee their homes more than ever before. Many have lost their jobs due to the pandemic, not the least in developing countries. We expect that some 30 to 40 million more live in poverty today compared to 1 year ago. And this is the first time in a century that we see an increase in poverty. At the same time, we see countries resigning on agreements, and there is a great need. And Ebba Busch, well, the Christian Democrats, compared to other parties, you've been our friend when it comes to giving development aid and the 1% objective. Can you guarantee that if you're to take over in government 2022, you'll stick to that 1% objective? Thinking about what the alliance parties have said. Ebba Busch.
Mycket, fru talman.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. That is correct. We've been proud defenders of generous, extensive overseas development aid from Sweden to the rest of the world. We maintain our ambition of 1%, but I think we need to be honest enough to be open about the problems it entails to just have a percentage point. We've seen how funds sent from Sweden being used unethically, how it's been used for parts of Palestine which have not reached the actual population in need. Rather, it has been used to fund terror organizations. We've seen in other cases where the money has not been received by smaller local players where you can have accountability. Rather, it's pumped into the large UN system and does not reach the intended recipients. And we've seen, at least in 2015, how funds are being used, claiming that it's being used for development aid, but it's used for migration in Sweden. Isabella Löfven.
Fru talman, nu tror jag att
Madam Speaker, I do think that we have many friends of development aid across the country who are now petrified listening to what Ebba Busch has to say in response. The OECD is evaluating what we do amongst, well, what other countries do as well, and we're always giving the best grade when it comes to how we execute development aid. And of course, these environments are very, very difficult, and therefore some of the money is at risk, but we need that risk in order to be able to reach those who really need our help. But the Christian Democrats this fall proposed that 1.8 billion should be used to build prisons in countries like Afghanistan and Somalia for Swedish prisoners. And the basic principle of development aid is to take poor people's needs for development as a starting point. And how do we help these individuals? By using development aid to build prisons for Swedish prisoners. Ebba Busch.
I know that many aid organizations and others are happy that we continue to maintain, well, they like the 1% goal, but that we are ambitious and generous, but that it has been used to fund migration in Sweden and used for the wrong purposes. But what about criticism at the Green Party internally? We proposed that we should use some of the money we already allocate to raise the humanitarian level in prisons, for example. In African countries, we never proposed that development aid money would be used to build prisons, but we'd like to add more money in legal policy provisions. In Lithuania or Latvia, like Norway are doing, because a father of two who was brutally murdered by an ATM machine by someone who should have been behind bars should also be behind bars. You failed to do that. Thank you. That concludes this round of rejoinders. Johan Persson of the Liberal Party has the floor for his second address.
Tack, fru talman.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. More than 500,000 people experience the fact that unemployment is higher, school grades lower, and a lot of marginalization. But we see that not just in cities, but also in smaller communities, for example, where companies have closed and individuals are forced to move to get a job, and they're struggling. But we see in these small communities that the only thing that's growing is the cemetery. We need schools that are based on knowledge, and the students and pupils need peace and quiet in school. And we need to invest in schools in many municipalities, in marginalized areas, and we do that through targeted funds to the most exposed to schools, and also to invest in upgrading our teachers. And this is something that is important, and it's gratifying to see that today we have investigation presented about language and knowledge of society in order to become a citizen of Sweden. Then serious crime, well, that is something that impacts many individuals in Sweden. We have to fight crime, and we need to do that long term so that young individuals have a perspective for the future. We also have to show that crime does not pay. Still today, sentences are not severe enough, and that is why we've presented a proposal to have a pact working against gang criminality. Migration policy, we have touched upon this today as well. We need a strict migration policy, and those who come to Sweden should be integrated and should be assisted so that they are integrated, but it has to be shaped after what we can manage. Sweden in many ways is a good country, focusing on schools, fighting crime. Well, if we do that, we can also be a good country in the future. Thank you. Ebba Busch has asked for a rejoinder. Please go ahead.
Fru talman, det svenska skattesystemet...
Madam Speaker, the Swedish tax system needs to be reviewed. Complex tax rules today is one of the biggest problems, not least in terms of VAT, but wealth taxation also difficult for businesses, not least. The Liberals requested a major tax reform in the last general election. This is part of the January agreement. It was a big victory for the Liberals, but where is it? Out of the January agreement tax ambitions, we have barely anything left. There was an article in Dagens Industri newspaper which points in the same direction. Now the Liberals are talking about the next term of office, a little bit like the song about the sick girl in hospital who's waiting to recover maybe next year. Has the Liberals handed the Social Democratic the government and power in order to get something later in the next life?
Madam Speaker, thank you for that intervention. Well, what we have in our agreement with the government has to do with strengthening those forces in Sweden that create wealth and welfare in the long term, and tax reform is an important part of that. And we have had a lot of piecemeal action. We have reduced taxes for companies, for individuals. We've also had tax easings for those who are the furthest removed from the labour market, and we have also invested in training and education so that people can find a job. And we do think that the changes to marginal taxes, well, people can keep half of the last earned krona. We think this is a good principle because wealth in this country we get from people being in employment. There is no other shortcut that can be used, but we need to make sure that people can work. Thank you. And Ebba Busch.
Madam Speaker, I get the impression that hope is still alive in Johan Persson in spite of lack of time, and Magdalena Andersson has said, and I quote, that she does not want to hear any silly remarks about reduced tax for work and labour, because the January parties do not tell us anything about their planned tax reductions. We have to look at their various government agencies. The Finance Policy Advice has some information. They have an expert group which has proposed higher property taxes. We need to make it harder and more difficult for anyone who owns their own house or accommodation. Property tax could be so tough that it can be decades before people are up on their feet again. If Johan Persson is so convinced with the fact that there will be a tax reform, even if it's in the next term of office, I wonder if he can also guarantee that it's not going to entail any new and increased property tax, or for that matter, property fees that are also increased. Johan Persson.
Well, thank you. Hope is the last thing to abandon man, and Ebba Busch knows that as well. And COVID has interrupted our work. We have had a tax reductions, and we have worked in a structural manner, and we liberals, we think that it's good to have this change when it comes to taxes, where we reduce tax on labour and increase tax on dirty energy. And when it comes to tax on capital and the property, we feel that the interest rate deduction, for example, should be phased out over time. And when it comes to the real estate tax, well, it can be increased, but I have to say that at home I see that there are small buildings who have the same amount that they have to pay as those who live in the biggest houses, and that is a bit absurd. But what we need to do is to do away with these interest rate deductions, slowly but surely. Thank you. That concludes that set of rejoinders, and we continue with the next speaker being Isabella Lövin. Please go ahead.
Fru talman.
Madam Speaker, now I think this is possibly the last time that I'm standing here in this rostrum. And now I'd like to turn to you, who is young, who's listening, and you have your doubts about politics. You're going to be perhaps voting for the first time, and you don't know whether there's any point because you just think that all politicians, they're the same anyway. And you've learnt about the climate crisis, and you feel, well, it's already too late. You who are angry at politics, you who feel that you've given up and that you're lost, or you think that society is just much too complicated. To all of you, I would like to say you are the ones who are going to help us develop our society. Society doesn't belong to somebody else. It's yours. It's ours together. For me, it took me half my professional life before I got to see politics from the inside, and what I know today is that nothing happens on its own accord. All changes happen because somebody wants them to happen, because somebody pushes for it, because somebody gets a majority to go along with it. It's not more difficult than that, actually, and there are two quite easy things that I would like you who have your doubts about politics that you need to understand. Firstly is that all politicians do not want the same thing. That's wrong. Political parties, they want different things in decisive areas. Secondly, in a democracy, all parties do need to cooperate to make a change, and that isn't to let your voters down. No, that's to get society to function properly and to pursue as much politics as you try to, as you can. And so if you believe those two things, then you believe that change is possible. So I ask you, please keep that feeling. The climate crisis is here. The earth is facing a huge threat, but you can make a difference. You can change. Your voice and your vote can give us a stronger, greener and more humane politics. Thank you very much, the Prime Minister, the Social Democrats, Ulf Kristersson from the Moderate Party, Jimmy Åkesson from the Sweden Democrats, Annie Lööf from the Centre Party, Nooshi Dadgostar from the Left Party, Ebba Busch from the Christian Democrats, Johan Persson from the Liberals requested a rejoinder. Let's start with this Prime Minister. Thank you.
Ja, fru talman, det är lätt.
Madam Speaker, we've heard many say that we can't just hand over the climate problems to children and grandchildren, but that we have to act. And it's easy to say, but then to actually do something, well, then we do not see as many being on board. But Isabella Lövin is always on board. You like to discuss, but you also want to collaborate, and you are attentive to what other people are saying. This is your last debate, so I want to say thank you for all these years, and I'm happy that we together produced this new climate framework, the Climate Act, and the Climate Council that is to evaluate the policy. We've also done a lot to reduce emissions, and we have accomplished many important action to do away with the reduced eutrophication and other problems. And we have also launched our initiative where we saw a clear result in Luleå up in north earlier during the fall, where they are now prepared to start to produce fossil-free steel. And you've been part of all this as well. The speaker for the member party, journalist, etc. Well, for a couple of decades, you have been one of the most important voices in Sweden talking for a green transition. And I believe that that voice will not become silent. I know that you will be doing other things, but I'm looking forward to staying in touch. And I also would like to, well, I hope that you'll have some time for contemplation, but that you'll also be able to be outdoors and go for walks. And I would like you to be able to go up north and look at that beautiful scenery. So that is why I would like to give this to you, and I'll also invite you for a meal when the pandemic allows you to come for a visit. Thank you, Isabella Lövin.
Fru talman, och tack.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Thank you, Prime Minister Stefan, for those kind words. I wasn't prepared for that, to be thanked already by you. As the head of the government, I am in my position for a few more weeks. But anyway, thank you very much for that. And let me also say that our two parties have learned a lot from each other during these years, almost 2 periods of government, and we were quite proud, we, the Green Party, when the Nature Conservation Association actually showed how we delivered on our promises for 2014, I think it was. Yes, well, from then looking at 2018, you had delivered much, much more environmental policy than you had promised. We had just delivered slightly less. But then we had, in fact, that we've done quite a lot together. And I think that really says a lot about this green transition, which means that our country has an advantage when it comes to our competitors, but also we can build something stronger after the pandemic. And thank you for this book as well. And when I'm allowed, I will quite happily go hiking in the Höga Kusten. Thank you. Next, Ulf Kristersson from the Moderate Party.
Fru talman, jag får se om
Madam Speaker, let's see if I have any questions to ask. But anyway, what I want to do is to say thank you to Isabella for debates, discussions, conversations in public and in private. And to be honest, we do not agree on much, you and I. But that is politics, and it's part of politics to be able to have an exchange with people who think differently. And I do think that you're a role model in a way that is kind of unique in Swedish politics. You've hinted at this yourself. There aren't too many who start another career and do have a working life doing something else than politics. We should see more of that, and we should also see more of people getting out of politics and maybe coming back again. I think that we would get more oxygen into Swedish politics that way. So you're a role model, and you can also distinguish between what is being discussed and the individual, and more people should be like you as well there. But we share an interest in nature, in forests and oceans and lakes. I know that you have a lot of experience from certain parts of Sweden, and I also have experiences, and well, my gift has to do with the most beautiful part of Sweden, which is Sörmland, where we have oceans, lakes, forests, and we also have hiking routes. This route is long. I do not expect a full report. It's 1,000 kilometers. I've walked half of the distance myself, and I hope that you will be able to walk this route, this hiking route as well. Isabella Lövin.
I think there's a theme here, actually, what I'm supposed to be doing after this, and I'm very happy to go along with that. And thank you, Ulf Kristersson, for those very kind words. It really pleases me to hear that I can be a role model, to hear that for everybody who enters into politics. And I really would like to say to everybody that anybody who feels that they really want to change things, then we have a unique democratic society and a system where you are able to do what I've been given the opportunity to do. Now, we haven't very often been of the same opinion, Ulf Kristersson, you and I, but we have worked together and had a lot to do with each other, and I really appreciate your leadership. We've sat down and we've spoken, perhaps not so officially and openly. We know quite quickly, both of us, when there's no point going on because nothing's going to happen. But you're very open to talk about with all parties, as do I. And I hope that my successor will be able to discuss things further with you. For example, how we can take Sweden out of the climate crisis and other important things. So thank you very much. Oh, which book was it? This one. Thank you for the present, for the gift, and thank you for our cooperation as well. Thank you. Next speaker is Jimmy Åkesson from the Sweden Democrats.
Ja, fru talman,
Madam Speaker, I'm not going to stick to that theme. Blekinge is another beautiful part of Sweden, and you're more than welcome to visit there as well. I'm totally objective, needless to say, but I'm thinking Africa. I've never been there. I don't know if you have, but I've been planting some trees there on your behalf, Isabella. Trees are good for the environment, for the climate, and they're also good to fight poverty in poorer parts of the world, and you'll get to this shortly. But let me just highlight something that Isabella herself said about how you can make a difference by trying to take on this task, that even if you do not have a majority of your own, you can do what you can to fight for the policy that you want to see. And well, good and bad, but you, the Green Party, you've been very good at doing that, to lead the Social Democratic Party into a greener direction. I'm not sure I like that, but you've been very successful. And you have been one of those individuals who accomplished that. And here's the gift. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. And then Isabella Lövin.
Tack, fru talman.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and thank you, Jimmy Åkesson, for this very, very fine gift. And I can see there's a bit of Swedish forest there. I don't think that's what's going to be planted there. No, I did get that. But we have very rarely had the same opinion about many things at all. And I will never forget when you once on the radio, you were asked and you had to say something positive about you. You said that I was a nice person and that people would like me, the citizens of this country. Well, you were wrong there as well. But anyway, thank you for having said that then. You did shock me a bit, but anyway, I would like to thank you because I know that you have a difficult task, and I know that more now as a spokesperson for the Green Party is a very important role to bear in Swedish democracy. So thank you for this. Thank you very much for your gift. Thank you. And next speaker, I guess, is Annie Lööf from the Centre Party.
Var den slut? Ja, fru talman.
Madam Speaker, that was a wonderful address, what we heard from Isabella about the future, about democracy and working for humanity, and also focusing on the young individuals. And that is very typical for your leadership, what we've seen during your career in politics. But before then, you actually wrote a book, Isabella, and that book was called Silent Seas. You focused on fish and overfishing in our oceans, and that gained a lot of attention. So the book was The Silent Seas, but you have far from been silent. You have talked about development aid, fisheries, climate, sustainability, and we have had different opinions, different perspectives. And the last few years we have cooperated to find green solutions within the framework of the January Agreement for a more sustainable Sweden. I would like to say thank you, Isabella, for all these discussions, for the cooperation, and I wish you the best in the future. I hope that you'll get some peace and quiet and time for your family. And yes, I do not mind going for a walk in Småland with you, Isabella, but my gift is something else. We have donated to the cause of living oceans because I know that is something that is very important for you. And I would like to say thank you and the best of luck in the future. Thank you. And Isabella Lövin.
Tack, Annie.
Oh, thank you, Annie Lööf. Thank you very much. This is a gift which is absolutely spot on. That feels fantastic. And I'd also like to thank you, Annie Lööf, for a very important period in Swedish politics and our cooperation with regard to the January Agreement, your personal courage to take that step across the block limit, as it were, due to the election results. Even I know it was a very difficult to do that in that difficult time. We've had different opinions in many questions. I don't think the Swedish people understand or realise that in fact it's the Centre Party and the Green Party that have most problems agreeing on things in the January Agreement, but we've always managed to find a path forward. And I'd really like to thank you for your constructive approach and your personal courage to stand up for people in difficult questions like refugee issues and human rights. And we need that today. So thank you very much indeed. Thank you. Next is Nooshi Dadgostar from the Left Party.
Ja, Isabella Lövin. Nu tänker alla, hur ska det här gå?
Well, Isabella, everyone is thinking, what will happen? My first debate among party leaders and your last. So doors are closing and doors are opening. And Isabella Lövin, well, I've looked at you from a distance, and you're this person who write a book about silent seas, and then you end up in the European Parliament and you work hard, and then you become a party leader for the Green Party. And it's obvious that Isabella Lövin is someone with a lot of knowledge about many different things, and also a lot of commitment in important questions and issues like the climate. And I'm very happy that I've had the opportunity to meet you, and I'm very happy that you've been in Swedish politics. For us who want to work for the climate, it's so important to have you with us there on the barricades, and I hope that you'll continue. I shouldn't say that doors are closing, because I know that you will continue, because you're that type of person. And I do know that there are many people out there who like you a lot, and all your knowledge. Well, I'm full of admiration, and also the skills that you've shown in Swedish politics. So thank you for all the work that you've done. You are a doer, which is important, and you make sure that things happen. So thank you for everything that you have done and everything you will do. We have given money to Save the Children in your name for their work with building schools, and also giving school supplies to children that live in areas of war and conflict. And I hope that that is a present you're happy with. Thank you. Thank you, Isabella Lövin.
Tack.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. And thank you, Nooshi Dadgostar, for those very, very kind words. I'll have to look at this, watch this debate in a couple of months' time, and to make myself feel better. But I guarantee you, I'm not going to stop standing on the barricades. No, I'm going to continue fighting for what we need, that we know and see that we need. But you also need to ensure that you do what you're best at. And I'm now going to see how I'm going to do other things instead. And Nooshi, it's a shame that we were just two ships that passed in the night, and that I don't get the chance to work more with you. But I do look forward to watching you and in your continued work, and I'd like to wish you the best of luck in the future. And thank you for this short period of cooperation, or at least our parties that we've had over the last few years. Thank you. Thank you. Next is Ebba Busch from the Christian Democrats.
Tack så mycket, fru talman.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Isabella Lövin, I would like to join in with the others, thanking you, and I'd like to throw money into the oceans. So we're going to top up the previous gift. We've lodged money to the World Wildlife Foundation for something I believe you would appreciate: cleaner oceans and a healthier environment. That is not throwing your money into the ocean, as it were. And we've made this decision based on your great knowledge and awareness. It has been underlined by others, and I can only agree. You have such a commitment and you're genuinely knowledgeable, and you're a great source of inspiration for many. I also know that you live in the rural community like myself, and you enjoy being around nature. And even if your voice will no longer be heard in this house, I've understood that through your pen, you will continue to be active to promote clean oceans and a cleaner environment for our children and grandchildren. And I wish you the best of luck in your endeavour. And I hope that in those capacities we can meet again further down the line. Thank you very much. Isabella Lövin.
Tack, fru talman.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and thank you, Ebba Busch, for those very fine words. And thank you for a very well-chosen gift as well. Well, what's being thrown in the sea is not going to disappear, is it? So, I think that was a very good point you made there. Because we need to work very hard for cleaner seas. And I'd like to thank you for stimulating debates, for clarity, the sense of clarity. And I'd also like to thank the Christian Democrats for always trying to discuss care for the elderly and healthcare, which of course are very important questions. We see that today. We need to have this generational perspective. And there are many good things that the Christian Democrats are looking into, and I believe and hope that the Christian Democrats will also prioritize climate and environment perhaps a little bit more going forward, because that's something that really is needed. But again, thank you very much, Ebba Busch, for your democratic commitment and involvement, because it's so important that we try to do this kind of thing, at least for a part of our professional lives. Next speaker is Johan Persson from the Liberal Party.
Tack, fru talman.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I agree, and I am also of the opinion that Isabella Lövin's address was important. Politics makes a difference, and if we have concerns about our future, we need to shoulder part of the responsibility. There needs to be a number of us. There are so many full and half and quarter broilers, as it were, in this parliament, but there are people who get in there, who leave, who come back. We all carry a part of this democratic responsibility together on our shoulders. We hope that we get you back. You're going to be walking across half of the country with all your the books that you've been giving on hikes, etc. But there are also issues such as the importance and knowledge about some of the minorities in Sweden, the Sami population. We'd like to give you this book on that topic as a gift. And we'd like to thank you for the perspective that you've provided and the journey you've embarked upon together with the Green Party, so that you can work with the Liberals in Stockholm in a right-wing context, and in the, locally in one way and at national level in another way, in a very responsible manner. And you've worked to ensure that we are solid supporters of the European Union, to see the force you've put into that journey. There are so many in the national parliaments of the European Union countries who are working towards this idea of solving problems together, not least that of the climate and our biological diversity. You've truly made a difference in that respect, and you've worked for a stronger EU. We appreciate it, and we thank you for it. Isabella Lövin, Green Party.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and thank you, Johan Persson, as well. I think it's been fun to work with you in these party leader debates, for example. I think you've done a really good job, not least by getting people to laugh every now and again in our debates. And I'd like to thank also you and the Liberal Party actually, for your intellectual honesty when it comes to EU cooperation, for example. The need for international cooperation, that the world isn't black and white always, but it's rather complicated, and that you need to understand that, grasp that. And I think that you do, and that is something that I really appreciate, let me say. So thank you very much for that, and thank you for the kind words, and thank you for a very interesting book, which I do look forward to read. And greetings to Nyonki Sabuni, the party leader, and Jan Björklund as well, because we have had quite a lot to do with each other with the January agreement negotiations, etc. And I'd like to wish you the best of luck going ahead. The Liberal Party is also a very important voice in Swedish politics. Thank you. And thank you. I would also like to say thank you on behalf of the speakers of this chamber to Isabella Lövin and to say good luck. And so that comes to the end of the debate, and I'd like to thank all of you who've participated in this debate and see you again soon. That's the end of the interpretation as well.
Vi är inte riktigt... Vi spar lite. Tack. Då vill jag anmäla punkt 3, anmälan om faktapromemoria. Jag anmäler att en faktapromemoria har inkommit och överlämnas till utskott enligt föredragningslistan. Punkt 4 och 5, ärenden för hänvisning till utskott. Propositioner hänvisas till utskott enligt förslag på föredragningslistan. Och därmed var samtliga ärenden på dagens föredragningslista behandlade och kammaren övergår till anmälan av dokument med mera som har inkommit under dagen. Jag får anmäla att en fråga framställts samt att svar på 7 skriftliga frågor har inkommit. Beslutar kammaren att avsluta sitt sammanträde? Svaret är ja.